The gas lamps had gone out along Whitechapel Road. In the blackness before dawn, a porter stepped into the Workhouse Morgue, his lantern swinging low across the stone floor. The smell reached him first. Not the usual stench of carbolic and decay, but something sharper, metallic, deliberate. His hand trembled as he raised the light. The sheet had been pulled back from the examination table. The body that had arrived the evening before was no longer whole. Pieces were missing, arranged. The surgical cuts were too clean, too purposeful to be the work of rats or time. Someone had been here in the darkness, working with precision and terrible intent. Outside, the city stirred toward a morning, costermongers loading their carts, factory bells beginning their call, the Thames flowing thick and brown past the docks. But here, in this forgotten corner of Victorian charity, something had happened that would never be explained. The porter's breath clouded in the cold air. He backed toward the door, the lantern still trained on what remained. And in that moment, he understood what the residents of the workhouse had whispered for weeks, that death itself had taken residence among them, and it was not finished with its work. Chapter 1. The Geometry of Charity. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small and still. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever hour finds you in darkness or lamp glow, know that you are not alone in seeking the company of the past. Perhaps it is late where you rest, or perhaps dawn approaches and sleep has not yet come. Tell us, if you would, where in this wide world you listen and what time keeps you. And if this journey into history's shadows brings you comfort, we ask that you subscribe to this channel, that you might return to these whispered chronicles again. Your presence here, your attention in this quiet hour, helps us continue this work, the preservation of stories that time has tried to forget. Share this tale if it moves you, for every listener who finds us in the dark helps ensure these histories endure. Now then, let us drift backward through the centuries to a London that no longer exists except in crumbling records and the memory of stone. The winter of 1887 settled over London like a shroud of coal, smoke and ice. In the eastern districts, where the Thames bent through docklands and slaughter yards, the cold came not as snow, but as a penetrating damp that worked its way through wool and flesh to settle in the bones. Here, in Whitechapel and Stepney, in Bethnal Green and Shoreditch, the architecture of poverty rose in blackened brick, tenements stacked against factories, courts opening onto alleys barely wide enough for a handcart, and everywhere the press of humanity seeking warmth and bread and a few hours of oblivion before the next day's struggle began again. Among these structures of desperation stood the workhouses, those monuments to Victorian charity that were neither charitable nor truly work, but rather warehouses for the human wreckage of industrial progress. The St. George in the East Union Workhouse occupied a full city block, its walls rising 3 stories in soot-stained brick, its windows arranged in perfect geometric rows that spoke of order imposed upon chaos. Iron gates opened onto a courtyard where the poor arrived day and night, seeking admission to a system designed to be just uncomfortable enough to discourage malingering, just harsh enough to separate the truly destitute from those who might yet find work in the world beyond its walls. The workhouse operated according to principles laid down by the Poor Law Amendment Act, that great engine of social reform that had reshaped England's approach to poverty half a century earlier. The philosophy was simple in its cruelty. Relief must be given only in conditions less desirable than the worst circumstances of independent labour. Thus the workhouse became a place of last resort, where families were separated upon entry, where men and women lived in different wards and saw each other only at chapel, where children were housed apart from parents and taught useful trades while their mothers picked oakum, until their fingers bled and their fathers broke stones in the yard. The day began at 6 in winter, 5 in summer, with the ringing of a bell that echoed through corridors smelling of carbolic and boiled cabbage, and unwashed bodies pressed too close together. The inmates rose from their narrow beds, 20 to a room, and dressed in the uniform of pauperdom, rough wool-dyed workhouse grey, shapeless garments that erased individuality, and marked the wearer as one who had failed in the great competition of existence. They filed to the dining hall for breakfast, a meal of bread and gruel that provided just enough sustenance to continue, but never enough to satisfy. Then came the work, the endless, meaningless labour that gave the institution its name. Oakum picking for the women, their hands pulling apart old ship's rope fibre by fibre until the skin cracked and bled. Stone breaking for the men, sledgehammers rising and falling in the yard regardless of weather. Bone crushing in the basement workshops, where the skeletons of horses and cattle were ground down for fertiliser and the air hung thick with calcium dust. The workhouse master presided over this empire of misery from his apartments on the upper floor, a position that brought a salary of £200 per year, plus accommodation and the power of absolute authority over hundreds of souls. Beneath him laboured a hierarchy of officials, the matron who governed the women's wards, the porter who controlled the gates, the schoolmaster who taught the children, the chaplain who offered spiritual consolation, and the medical officer who attended to the sick and dying in the infirmary wing. For the workhouse was also a hospital of sorts. Though the medicine practised, there was often little more than palliative care for those too old or ill to recover. The infirmary occupied the eastern wing, its windows facing the rising sun as if light itself might cure what poverty and age had broken. Here lay the consumptives coughing their lungs away, the old women whose bodies had simply worn out after 7 decades of childbearing and labour, the men whose hearts or kidneys or livers had failed, the accident victims from the docks and factories, the stroke patients half paralysed and unable to speak. They died regularly, these inmates of the infirmary, sometimes several in a week during the winter months, when influenza and pneumonia swept through the crowded wards. And when they died, their bodies were carried down to the morgue, a stone chamber in the basement where the dead awaited burial in the pauper's ground. The morgue had been designed with Victorian practicality. Stone walls that stayed cool year-round, a floor sloped toward a drain, examination tables of slate, and shelves along one wall where the bodies could be stored temporarily in simple wooden coffins if the death rate exceeded the burial capacity. Gas jets provided light for the medical officer when he came to certify death and record the cause in his ledger, that great book of final diagnoses that documented how poverty killed. Malnutrition, exhaustion, occupational disease, the accidents of desperate labour, and simple old age unrelieved by comfort or care. The morgue keeper was a man named Thomas Wickham, a porter who had worked at the institution for 15 years and knew every corner of its vast structure. He was a thin man with careful hands and the quiet manner of one who spent too long in the company of the dead. His duties were simple: receive the bodies from the infirmary, lay them out for examination, ensure they were properly shrouded before burial, and maintain the register that recorded name, age, date of death, and the plot number in the burial ground where each pauper would spend eternity in unmarked anonymity. The medical officer was Dr. Edmund Carr, a man of 40 years who had trained at Guy's Hospital and fallen into workhouse medicine through a combination of debt and drink and the gradual narrowing of opportunities that came to men who could not maintain a private practice. He was competent enough when sober, which was most mornings, and his examinations of the dead were thorough if unremarkable. He certified death, noted probable cause, signed the necessary papers, and moved on to the next case in his daily rounds through the infirmary wards. The workhouse operated on a rhythm as regular as a heartbeat, as predictable as the bells that marked each transition from one activity to another. 6 in the morning, rising bell. 7, breakfast. 8, work begins. Noon, dinner. 1, work resumes. 6, supper. 8, chapel. 9, lights out, and throughout each day at irregular intervals, the tolling of the chapel bell announcing another death, another soul released from the workhouse into whatever awaited beyond the veil. In this regimented world of controlled desperation, where every hour was accounted for and every individual was reduced to a number in a ledger, where privacy did not exist and personal possessions were forbidden, and families were torn apart in the name of efficiency, the dead were the only ones who had finally escaped. They lay in the basement morgue, awaiting the weekly burial detail that would carry them to the paupers' field, a patch of ground behind the workhouse where the poor were interred without headstones, 20 to a plot, their bodies wrapped in shrouds and lowered into common graves with only the briefest of Anglican services to mark their passing. No one kept watch over the dead at night. The morgue door was locked, but the key hung in the porter's lodge, accessible to the night staff who might need entry if a death occurred during the dark hours. The medical officer did not sleep at the workhouse, but maintained a residence 3 streets distant, arriving each morning at 8 to begin his rounds. The night porter made rounds through the building every 2 hours, checking that doors were locked and inmates were abed and no fires had started in the kitchens or workshops. But the morgue was simply another room to be glanced at in passing, a door to be tested to ensure it remained secure. The gas lamps along Whitechapel Road guttered low after midnight, their light barely penetrating the fog that rolled in from the river. In the workhouse, silence settled over the wards where the living slept their exhausted seat, and deeper silence reigned in the basement where the dead lay waiting. The building creaked and settled, old brick adjusting to the cold, pipes ticking as temperatures dropped. And in that darkness, in those hours between the last round at midnight and the first stirrings of dawn at 5, the workhouse held its secrets close, as all institutions do, protecting itself with walls and locked doors, and the simple assumption that what happened in darkness would remain unknown. The winter passed in its usual procession of cold days and frozen nights. Bodies arrived in the morgue with regularity. The register grew thick with names. The burial ground received its weekly additions, and no one noticed, not yet, that something had changed in the geometry of the workhouse, that a new variable had entered the equation of life and death and disposal, that someone had begun to take an interest in the unclaimed dead that went beyond the perfunctory duties of certification and burial. Not yet. That realization would come later, with the dawn, with a lantern raised in a stone chamber, with the understanding that some violations of the dead could not be explained by rats or time or natural decay, but required human hands working with purpose in the darkness. Chapter 2. The First Disappearance. The discovery came not with drama, but with confusion, discrepancy in paperwork that should have aligned but did not. It was the 3rd week of January 1887, a Monday morning when the fog sat so thick over the Thames that the ships in the dock sounded their bells constantly, invisible to one another, navigating by sound alone through the grey opacity. Thomas Wickham stood in the morgue with his register open on the examination table, counting the shrouded forms that lay waiting for burial. The weekly interment was scheduled for Tuesday, and he performed this task every Monday afternoon, ensuring that the number of bodies matched the number of names recorded, that each death certified by Dr. Carr had resulted in a corresponding corpse prepared for the ground. He counted 3 times, certain he had made an error. 7 names in the register for the week past, 6 bodies on the shelves. He checked each shroud, pulling back the rough cloth to verify the faces against the descriptions he had noted. An old woman with white hair, a young man with a scar across his cheek, another woman middle-aged and unremarkable. He knew these dead. He had received them from the infirmary, had laid them out himself, had recorded their particulars in his careful hand, but one was missing. The space where the 7th should have lain showed only bare wood, the shelf empty, no sign that a body had ever rested there. Wickham was not a man given to panic, but a coldness settled in his chest as he reviewed his records. The missing body belonged to one Margaret Hollis, aged 62, died Thursday evening of heart failure according to Dr. Carr's certification. Wickham himself had collected her from the women's infirmary, had noted her grey hair and the mole on her left cheek, had wrapped her in a shroud and placed her on the 3rd shelf from the floor. He remembered this clearly because she had been heavier than most, and he had struggled with the weight, finally securing her in place with the back aching from the effort. That had been Thursday night, near 11 o'clock. Now it was Monday, 3 days later, and Margaret Hollis was gone. Not misplaced, not moved to another location, but absent entirely. The shroud was missing as well, and the shelf showed no disturbance, no sign of struggle or haste. Someone had simply removed a body from a locked morgue in a building where hundreds of people lived and worked and slept, and had done so without being observed or leaving evidence of the act. Wickham locked the morgue and went immediately to find the workhouse master, a man named Gerald Pemberton, who had held the position for 8 years and prided himself on the efficient operation of his institution. Pemberton was in his office reviewing supply requisitions when Wickham knocked, and his irritation at the interruption showed plainly on his face until Wickham explained the situation. Then the irritation transformed into something colder, a calculation of potential scandal and official inquiry, and the threat to his positions that any irregularity might bring. They returned to the morgue together, Pemberton moving with the quick, nervous energy of a man who sensed disaster approaching. He verified the count himself, checked the register, examined the empty shelf. His questions came rapid and sharp. When had Wickham last seen the body? Who else had access to the morgue? Were the keys accounted for? Had there been any unusual activity in the building during the weekend? Wickham answered each query with the same information. The body had been present Thursday night. The morgue had been locked. The keys hung in the porter's lodge where any member of the night staff might access them, and no one had reported anything out of the ordinary. Pemberton stood in the centre of the morgue, his breath visible in the cold air, his mind working through the implications. A missing body suggested several possibilities, none of them acceptable. Theft was the most obvious explanation. But who would steal a pauper's corpse, and for what purpose? The days of the resurrectionists were long past, those ghouls who had once supplied the medical schools with fresh cadavers for dissection. The Anatomy Act of 1832 had ended that trade by allowing hospitals and medical institutions legal access to unclaimed bodies. There was no market for stolen corpses anymore, no reason for someone to risk imprisonment by removing a body from a workhouse morgue, unless the body had not been stolen at all, but had simply been buried early, taken to the pauper's field by mistake or through some confusion in the burial schedule. Pemberton seized on this possibility with visible relief. Perhaps one of the burial details had come on the wrong day, had collected a body without checking the register, had interred Margaret Hollis ahead of schedule. It was irregular, certainly a violation of procedure, but not criminal, not scandalous, not the sort of thing that would bring investigators or journalists or questions from the Board of Guardians who oversaw the workhouse operations. They went to the burial ground, Pemberton and Wickham together, walking the short distance behind the main building to where the pauper's field stretched in bleak geometry. The ground was frozen, hard as iron, and no fresh graves had been dug since the previous Tuesday's burial. The sexton who maintained the grounds confirmed that no interments had occurred outside the regular schedule, that the burial detail had not been called, that the ground itself would have shown obvious signs of recent digging. Margaret Hollis was not in the earth. She was simply gone, vanished from a locked room in a building that never slept, spirited away by unknown hands for unknown purposes. Pemberton made his decision with the pragmatism of a man whose career depended on avoiding scandal. They would search the workhouse thoroughly, checking every storeroom and cellar and unused space where a body might have been moved by accident or confusion. They would question, the staff discreetly asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual, but they would not report the disappearance to the police, not yet, not until they had exhausted every possible explanation that might keep the matter internal. The Board of Guardians met monthly, and if the body was found before then, if some reasonable explanation emerged, there would be no need to document the incident in official reports that might be read by journalists or reformers looking for evidence of workhouse mismanagement. The search consumed 2 days. Every member of the staff was interviewed, the matron, the schoolmaster, the kitchen workers, the nurses in the infirmary, the night porters who made rounds through the dark hours. No one had seen anything. The night porter, who had been on duty Thursday through Sunday, was a man named Albert Sykes, 20 years in service, reliable and thorough in his rounds. He had checked the morgue door each night at midnight and again at 2 a.m, had found it locked both times, had heard nothing unusual, had seen no one in the basement corridors. The other staff members reported similar nothing, the absence of information that was itself a kind of evidence. Dr. Carr was informed of the disappearance on Wednesday morning. He arrived at Pemberton's office with his medical bag, his face showing the slight flush and broken capillaries that marked his evenings with gin. When told that Margaret Hollis was missing, he pulled his certification book from his bag and reviewed the entry. Heart failure, he had written, death occurring approximately 9 in the evening, body rigid and cold when examined at 10. He had no explanation for the disappearance. The woman had been dead when he examined her, unquestionably dead, and what happened to her body afterward was not his concern unless someone was suggesting negligence on his part. Pemberton assured him no such suggestion was being made, but asked whether the woman might have been in a comatose state rather than dead, whether she might have revived and walked away from the morgue through some medical miracle. Carr dismissed this possibility with contempt. He had certified hundreds of deaths, knew the signs of mortality with certainty, and Margaret Hollis had been dead beyond any doubt. Her disappearance was a mystery certainly, but not a medical mystery. Someone had taken the body, and Pemberton's job was to determine who and why, not to question Carr's professional competence. By Thursday, a week after the disappearance, Pemberton was forced to acknowledge that the body would not be found through internal investigation. He drafted a carefully worded report for the Board of Guardians, describing the incident as probable theft and noting that all reasonable efforts had been made to locate the missing remains. The report mentioned nothing of resurrection men or body snatchers, used no language that might suggest scandal or sensationalism, and emphasised the security measures already in place at the workhouse. The morgue door would now be checked hourly rather than every 2 hours. The keys would be kept in the master's office rather than the porter's lodge. Additional gas lamps would be installed in the basement corridors to discourage unauthorised access. The board received the report at their February meeting, with the grim acceptance of men who knew that workhouses operated in the margins of respectability, that the poor died in large numbers and were buried with minimal ceremony, and that occasional irregularities were inevitable in institutions that processed human misery on an industrial scale. They noted the incident in their minutes, approved the enhanced security measures, and moved on to other business. No police investigation was requested. No public announcement was made. Margaret Hollis was simply noted as deceased and buried. Her name added to the ledger with a notation that her interment had occurred at an unrecorded time and location. Thomas Wickham returned to his duties with the uneasy sense that something in the workhouse had shifted, that the orderly world of documented death and scheduled burial had been violated in a way that could not be repaired by additional locks or more frequent rounds. He counted the bodies each Monday with increased care, verified each name against each face, and at night when he locked the morgue door he paused to listen, as if the stone walls might whisper some explanation for what had happened in the darkness. But the morgue kept its silence, and the weeks passed, and winter deepened over London, and in the wards above, the sick and old continued their dying, ignorant of the mystery that had begun in the chamber below their feet. The disappearance of Margaret Hollis might have remained an isolated incident, a single unexplained event to be filed away and forgotten, had it not been for what came next. But history does not offer such mercies. What begins in darkness often continues there, gathering momentum, establishing patterns, until the weight of accumulated horror becomes too great to ignore. And so it would be with the Workhouse Morgue, where the dead were about to become something other than simply dead, where the boundary between medical examination and desecration was about to be crossed by hands that understood anatomy far too well. Chapter 3. The Porter's Discovery. March arrived with rain that fell steadily for days, turning the streets to mud and the courtyards to shallow lakes that reflected the grey sea. In the workhouse, the dampness crept through walls and settled in the lungs of the infirmary patients, and the death rate increased as it always did in the wet months, when pneumonia found easy victims among the weak and elderly. Thomas Wickham found himself busier than usual, collecting bodies from the wards at all hours, maintaining his register with growing frequency, preparing for burial details that came twice weekly instead of once. It was a Tuesday morning, the 20th of March, when he entered the morgue at dawn to prepare for the day's interment. The gas jets were unlit. and he carried a lantern that cast moving shadows across the stone walls. 4 bodies awaited burial, all elderly, all having died of respiratory complaints during the weekend. He had laid them out himself on Sunday evening, had recorded their details, had shrouded them in the rough cloth that served as their final garment. Now he needed to move them to the wooden coffins that would be carried to the burial ground. Needed to ensure everything was ready for the burial detail that would arrive at 9. He set his lantern on the examination table and turned to the shelves where the bodies lay. Something was wrong. He knew it immediately, felt it in the way the shadows fell, in the quality of silence that pressed against his ears. The first body, an old man named Joseph Crane, lay as Wickham had left him, shroud wrapped tight, face covered. But the second body, a woman named Elizabeth Moore, was not quite right. The shroud was disarranged, pulled loose at one end, the fabric bunched in a way that suggested handling. Wickham approached slowly, his breath coming faster, his hands beginning to tremble. He pulled back the shroud, expecting perhaps to find that rats had gotten to the body despite the care taken to keep the morgue sealed. But what the lantern light revealed had nothing to do with rats or natural decay. Elizabeth Moore's chest had been opened, not torn or gnawed, but opened with precision, a long vertical incision running from throat to sternum, the edges of the cut clean and straight as if made with a surgical knife. The ribs had been separated, spread apart to expose the chest cavity, and inside, where organs should have been, there was emptiness. Wickham made a sound, something between a gasp and a moan, and backed away from the table. His lantern swung wildly, shadows leaping across the walls. He forced himself to remain calm, to think clearly, to examine what he was seeing rather than fleeing from it. He moved to the next body, pulled back its shroud. Another incision, equally precise, equally thorough. The third body, the fourth, both violated in the same way, opened and emptied with surgical skill. He ran from the morgue, his footsteps echoing through the basement corridors, up the stairs to the porter's lodge where the day staff were just arriving for their shifts. He found Gerald Pemberton in his office, the workhouse master reviewing the morning's reports over tea and toast. Wickham's appearance, wild-eyed, breathless, unable to speak coherently at first, brought Pemberton to his feet with alarm. When Wickham finally managed to explain what he had found, Pemberton's face went grey. They returned to the morgue together, Pemberton moving with the rigid control of a man forcing himself forward against every instinct. The lantern light confirmed what Wickham had reported. 4 bodies, all opened, all violated. Pemberton stood in the centre of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his breathing shallow. He was not a man with medical training, but he knew enough to recognise surgical incisions when he saw them. Someone had operated on these corpses, had removed organs with skill and knowledge, had done so in this locked room during the night hours when the building slept. Dr. Carr was summoned immediately. He arrived within the hour, still in his morning clothes, his face showing the irritation of a man pulled from his breakfast. The irritation vanished when he saw the bodies. He examined each one in silence, his trained eye taking in the precision of the cuts, the careful separation of ribs, the systematic removal of organs. When he finished, he stepped back from the examination table and removed his spectacles to clean them, a gesture that allowed him time to compose his thoughts. His assessment was clinical and damning. The incisions were professional, made by someone with anatomical knowledge and surgical experience. The organs had been removed with care. Heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, taken entire rather than damaged or torn. The work had been done with proper instruments, sharp scalpels and bone saws, not the crude tools of a common criminal. And most significantly, the violations had occurred post-mortem, several hours after death, when the bodies were already cold and rigid. This was not the work of a madman operating in frenzy, but of someone who had worked methodically, taking their time, confident they would not be interrupted. Pemberton asked the question that hung in the air between them. Who had access to the morgue? Who possessed the necessary skill? Who could have done this without being observed or heard? Carr had no answers. only the evidence before him. The medical staff at the workhouse consisted of himself and 2 nurses, neither of whom had surgical training or any reason to be in the morgue during night hours. The nearest hospital was Guy's, where Carr himself had trained, but that was miles distant, and no student or physician from that institution would have any business at a workhouse morgue. The matter could no longer be contained within the institution. Pemberton accepted this with visible reluctance, knowing that police involvement meant official reports, newspaper attention, and the scrutiny of authorities who might find other irregularities in the workhouse operations. But 4 bodies had been desecrated, and there was no way to explain such desecration as accident or confusion. A crime had been committed, and it required investigation. Scotland Yard was notified that afternoon. 2 detectives arrived on Wednesday morning, representatives of the Criminal Investigation Department who specialised in unusual crimes. They were men of middle years, dressed in dark suits, carrying notebooks and an air of professional scepticism. Detective Inspector William Ashford was the senior officer, a man with grey in his beard and 20 years of experience investigating London's darker corners. His partner, Detective Sergeant Harold Bennett, was younger, still learning the trade, but observant and methodical in his approach. They examined the morgue with careful attention, noting the locked door, the single entrance, the gas jets that provided light, the slate examination table, the shelves where bodies were stored. They questioned Wickham about his procedures, about the keys, about who had access to the room and when. They interviewed the night porters, the medical staff, the workhouse master himself. They took statements from everyone who had been in the building during the relevant hours, documenting whereabouts and alibis with patient thoroughness. The bodies themselves were photographed, a new technique that was beginning to be used in criminal investigations. A police photographer arrived with his equipment, setting up his camera in the morgue, capturing images of the incisions and the open chest cavities. The photographs would serve as evidence, permanent records of the violation that could be studied and analysed away from the scene itself. Ashford's preliminary assessment, delivered to Pemberton in private, was not encouraging. The morgue showed no signs of forced entry, the lock was intact, the door undamaged. Whoever had gained access had used a key, which meant either a member of the workhouse staff or someone who had obtained a key through theft or duplication. The skill demonstrated in the surgical work suggested medical training, which narrowed the field of suspects considerably, but also made the crime more disturbing. Someone with the knowledge to heal had used that knowledge to violate the dead. The investigation expanded to include the medical institutions in the area. Ashford sent inquiries to Guy's Hospital, to the London Hospital in Whitechapel, to the private anatomy schools that still operated despite the legal availability of cadavers. He asked about missing surgical instruments, about students or staff who'd shown unusual interest in post-mortem examination, about anyone who might have both the skill and the inclination to commit such acts. The responses came back over the following weeks, all negative. No instruments were missing, no suspicious individuals had been identified. The hospitals and schools were properly regulated, their dissection rooms monitored, their cadavers accounted for. The question of motive troubled Ashford deeply. If the purpose had been theft of organs for sale, why take them from a workhouse where they would be of minimal value? The organs of paupers who died of old age and disease were not sought after by the medical institutions, which had legal access to healthier specimens from the unclaimed dead. If the purpose had been practice for a medical student, why take such risk when legitimate opportunities for dissection existed? And if the purpose had been some darker compulsion, some need to violate the dead for psychological satisfaction, why choose a location as risky as a workhouse morgue where discovery was probable? The newspapers learned of the investigation within days, as they always did, through contacts in the police department or through workhouse staff who sold information for pennies. The story appeared first in the Illustrated Police News, then spread to the daily papers, each account more sensational than the last. Workhouse horrors, the headlines proclaimed. Body snatchers return to London. The coverage forced Pemberton to issue a statement denying any negligence on the part of the workhouse administration emphasising the security measures already in place and the full cooperation being given to police investigators. The publicity brought consequences Pemberton had feared. The Board of Guardians convened an emergency meeting to review workhouse procedures. Reformers who had long criticised the poor law system used the incident as evidence of institutional failure. Questions were raised in Parliament about the security of workhouses generally, and whether the dead were being treated with proper respect. Pemberton found himself defending not just his own administration, but the entire system of poor relief, arguing that one criminal act did not invalidate decades of charitable work. Through it all, the morgue remained a crime scene, cordoned off by police order, inaccessible even to Wickham, who had tended it for 15 years. The bodies that had been violated were held as evidence, not released for burial until the investigation concluded. New deaths in the infirmary required temporary storage in a converted cellar room, an awkward arrangement that disrupted the normal rhythms of institutional death and disposal. And every member of the workhouse staff, from the master to the lowest kitchen worker, lived under suspicion, knowing that someone among them might be the perpetrator, that the hands that served meals or dispensed medicine or kept accounts might also be the hands that had opened those bodies in darkness. The investigation continued through April with no clear resolution. Ashford interviewed medical professionals across London, checked alibis and backgrounds, searched for any connection between the workhouse and the surgical community, but the trail remained cold, the evidence circumstantial, the suspect unknown. And then, in early May, when it seemed the case might fade into the vast catalogue of unsolved crimes that burdened Scotland Yard, something happened that changed everything. Another body was found violated, and this time there was a witness. Chapter 4. The Anatomy of Suspicion. The witness was a woman named Sarah Collins, a nurse in the infirmary who had worked at the workhouse for 7 years. She was 40 years of age, a widow whose husband had died in a factory accident, leaving her to support herself through respectable employment in charitable institutions. She was known among the staff as capable and calm, the sort of nurse who could manage dying patients with efficiency and minimal sentiment, who understood that death in the workhouse was not tragedy but simple conclusion to lives that had held little enough joy or comfort. On the night of May 4th, a Tuesday, Sarah had been assigned to the night shift in the women's infirmary, a duty that rotated among the nursing staff and required wakefulness from 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning. The work was simple enough, checking on patients every hour, administering medicines as prescribed by Dr. Carr, providing water or comfort to those who could not sleep, and summoning help if a death occurred during the night hours. 2 women had died that evening, both elderly, both expected. Sarah had performed the necessary tasks, closing eyes, binding jaws, recording times of death in the ward ledger, and had sent word to the porter's lodge that bodies required collection. Thomas Wickham had arrived near midnight to collect the dead. Since the desecration in March, a new procedure had been implemented. Bodies were no longer stored in the morgue overnight, but were placed in the converted cellar room under lock, with the key held by the workhouse master rather than left accessible to the night staff. In the morning, Dr. Carr would examine them there, certify death, and authorise their transfer to the burial ground. It was an awkward system, but one that Pemberton hoped would prevent further violations. Sarah had helped Wickham move the bodies from the infirmary beds to the canvas stretchers he used for transport. They had covered the dead women in sheets and carried them down the stairs to the cellar, working in silence as people do when handling the dead. The cellar room was cold and dark, lit only by Wickham's lantern, and Sarah had been glad to complete the task quickly and return to the warmer precincts of the infirmary. She had watched Wickham lock the cellar door, had seen him pocket the key that he would deliver to Pemberton's office before ending his shift at dawn. But Sarah had forgotten her own keys in the cellar, a ring with her infirmary cabinet key and her personal locker key, both essential for her duties. She realised this an hour later when she needed to access the medicine cabinet for a patient's laudanum dose. Rather than wake the entire staff searching for spare keys, she decided to retrieve her own. She knew where Wickham kept his duplicate cellar key, in the porter's lodge, hanging on a board with other institutional keys. She took it without asking permission, not wanting to explain her carelessness, intending to retrieve her keys and return Wickham's copy before anyone noticed its absence. She descended to the cellar near 2 a.m, moving through the quiet building with her own small lamp. The cellar door was locked as it should be. She opened it and stepped inside, raising her lamp to locate her keys on the floor where she believed they had fallen. The light revealed the 2 bodies on their stretchers, still covered in sheets, and it revealed something else. A figure stood bent over one of the bodies, dressed in dark clothing, face obscured by the shadow. The sheet had been pulled back. In the figure's hand, something glinted in the lamplight. A surgical knife, long and narrow, already stained with fluid. Sarah made no sound, too shocked for immediate reaction, but the lamp in her hand shook, casting erratic light across the cellar walls. The figure straightened, turned toward her. For a moment they stood frozen, nurse and intruder, separated by 10 feet of stone floor and the gulf between normal life and whatever act was being committed in that underground room. Then the figure moved, not towards Sarah, but away, toward a second door at the far end of the cellar, a service entrance that opened onto the exterior stairs leading to the courtyard. The door swung open, admitting a rush of cold air and rain, and the figure was gone, vanishing into the wet darkness of the London night. Sarah dropped her lamp. It shattered on the stone floor, extinguishing immediately, plunging the cellar into blackness broken only by faint light from the open door. She turned and ran, stumbling through the dark corridors, up the stairs, shouting for help in a voice that echoed through the building and woke dozens of sleeping inmates. Staff came running from all directions. Porters, nurses, the night matron. Within minutes, the cellar was filled with people and lamplight, and what Sarah had glimpsed was confirmed by multiple witnesses. One of the bodies had been opened. The same precise vertical incision, the same separation of ribs, the same evidence of surgical skill. But this time the work was incomplete, interrupted by Sarah's arrival before the organs could be removed. And this time there was additional evidence. Muddy footprints leading from the body to the exterior door, made by boots with a distinctive pattern in the sole. Detective Inspector Ashford was summoned immediately, arriving at the workhouse before dawn, his clothing hastily assembled, his face showing both exhaustion and the grim satisfaction of finally having a break in the case. The exterior door became the focus of intense investigation. It was a service entrance, used by delivery workers bringing supplies to the cellar storerooms, locked from inside by a simple bolt that could be easily opened by anyone with access to the cellar. Ashford examined the door carefully, noting that the lock showed no signs of forced entry from outside, which meant the intruder had not broken in but had exited through this route after entering the building through some other means. The muddy footprints led across the courtyard to the perimeter wall, where marks in the wet earth suggested someone had climbed over, dropping down into the alley beyond. Sarah's testimony was taken in detail, recorded with the careful precision required for potential court proceedings. She described what she had seen: a figure in dark clothing, height approximately 5 feet and 8 inches, build neither heavy nor slight but average, face not visible in the poor light. She had seen the knife clearly, a surgical instrument with a curved blade, the sort used in dissection work. She had not seen the intruder's face clearly enough to identify gender with certainty, though her impression had been of a man based on the figure's height and bearing. The entire encounter had lasted perhaps 10 seconds, too brief for detailed observation, but long enough to confirm that a violation was in progress. The investigation expanded with renewed intensity. If the intruder had been inside the building, had accessed the cellar with knowledge of its location and purpose, then either someone on the staff was responsible, or someone had detailed information about workhouse operations. Ashford ordered a comprehensive review of everyone associated with the institution: current staff, former employees who had left in recent months, delivery workers who made regular visits, even physicians from nearby hospitals who might have treated workhouse patients and thereby gained familiarity with the building's layout. The footprints were analysed by a police expert who specialised in such evidence. The boot pattern was common, manufactured by multiple cobblers across London, impossible to trace to a specific individual. but the size suggested a man of average build consistent with Sarah's observation. The depth of the prints in the mud indicated someone neither particularly heavy nor light, again matching the description of the figure she had glimpsed. Dr. Carr found himself under particular scrutiny. He had access to surgical instruments, possessed the necessary anatomical knowledge, and was familiar with every aspect of the workhouse, including the cellar and its doors. His background was investigated thoroughly, his training at Guy's Hospital, his previous positions at other charitable institutions, his financial situation, his personal habits. Ashford interviewed Carr's colleagues, his landlady, the publican at the tavern where he took his evening drinks. The picture that emerged was of a man whose career declined through drink and debt, who performed his workhouse duties competently but without enthusiasm, who had no obvious motive for desecrating bodies but also no solid alibi for the nights when violations had occurred. Carr responded to the investigation with outrage, insisting that his professional reputation was being destroyed by baseless suspicion. He pointed out that a physician of his experience would have completed the organ removal in the time available, would not have been interrupted by a nurse's unexpected arrival. He demanded to know what possible motive he could have for such crimes, what benefit he could derive from stealing organs from corpses when he had legal access to cadavers through his position. His protests were noted but did not eliminate him as a suspect. The nursing staff came under similar examination. 3 nurses worked at the workhouse, rotating between day and night shifts. Besides Sarah Collins, there was Martha Green, a younger woman of 25 who had trained at the London Hospital, and Agnes Porter, an older nurse of 50 years who had worked in charity institutions throughout her adult life. Ashford interviewed each extensively, asking about their training, their familiarity with anatomy, their access to surgical instruments. None had any obvious connection to the crimes, but neither could any of them account for their whereabouts during all the nights when bodies had been violated. The Porter staff numbered 4 men who rotated duties, managing the sins, collecting bodies from the infirmary, maintaining security during night hours. Thomas Wickham was the most experienced, but the others had also been present during various incidents. Each was interviewed, their backgrounds investigated, their living situations examined. One porter, a man named Robert Hayes, had previously worked at a medical school as a custodian, bringing him into contact with anatomical facilities and dissection rooms. This connection earned him particular attention, though investigation revealed he had left that position years earlier, due to illness, not misconduct. Pemberton himself was questioned, though with the deference owed to his position. He accounted for his whereabouts during the incidents, provided character references from the Board of Guardians, demonstrated his complete lack of medical knowledge or surgical skill. Nevertheless, Ashford noted that as workhouse master, Pemberton had access to all keys, knew all procedures, and could move through the building at any hour without attracting suspicion. He had no motive that Ashford could determine, but opportunity and means were certainly present. The investigation produced volumes of testimony, dozens of statements, endless details about institutional operations and personal habits, but it produced no definitive suspect, no clear evidence pointing to one individual above all others. The medical skill required suggested someone with training, but that training could have been acquired in various ways. Formal education at a medical school, apprenticeship with a physician, self-study of anatomical texts, or military service where surgical emergencies required quick learning. The access to the workhouse suggested insider knowledge, but such knowledge could have been obtained through employment, through casual observation during deliveries or other business, or simply through patience and careful study of the institution's routines. May passed into June with the case still unresolved. Ashford spent long hours reviewing evidence, comparing statements, searching for inconsistencies or connections he might have missed. The muddy footprints remained the most tangible clue, but they led nowhere except over a wall and into the vast anonymity of London streets. The surgical knife had not been found despite searches of the workhouse and its surroundings. The stolen organs, whatever had been done with them, had left no trace. And then, on a warm evening in late June, another body was found violated. this time in a different workhouse across the city, in Bethnal Green, where the institutional procedures were similar, but the staff was entirely different. The pattern of violation was identical, the precise incision, the careful removal of organs, the professional skill evident in every aspect of the work. The perpetrator had moved beyond St. George in the East, had expanded their operations, had demonstrated that no workhouse morgue in London was secure. The case was no longer an isolated incident, but a series, a pattern, a campaign of desecration that seemed destined to continue until the perpetrator was caught or chose to stop of their own accord. Chapter 5. The Resurrectionist's Shadow. The discovery at Bethnal Green brought panic to the poor law institutions across London. Within days of the incident becoming public knowledge, workhouse masters throughout the city were reviewing their security procedures, installing additional locks, posting guards in morgue areas, and demanding that the Metropolitan Police provide protection for their facilities. The Board of Guardians convened emergency meetings, consulting with Scotland Yard about coordination between different workhouse investigations and whether the incidents represented organised crime or the work of a single disturbed individual. Detective Inspector Ashford found himself coordinating a much larger investigation than he had initially anticipated. The Bethnal Green case was assigned to a different detective, but the similarities between the violations were too obvious to ignore, and within a week Ashford had absorbed that case into his own portfolio. He now had evidence from 2 separate institutions, statements from different sets of witnesses, and the frustrating realization that the perpetrator had moved freely between locations without leaving any trail that could be followed. The Bethnal Green workhouse had experienced a single violation, discovered on the morning of June 23rd when the morgue keeper arrived to find a body opened in the same precise manner as those at St. George in the East. The victim was an elderly man who had died of consumption, his organs removed with surgical skill during the night hours. There had been no witnesses to the act, no disturbances reported by night staff, no evidence of forced entry. The morgue had been locked, the key secured in the master's office, yet somehow access had been gained and the violation completed without detection. Ashford spent a week at Bethnal Green, interviewing staff, examining the morgue, comparing every detail to what he had learned at St. George in the East. The similarities extended beyond the surgical technique to include institutional procedures. Both workhouses followed the same protocols for handling the dead. Both kept keys in similar locations. Both employed night porters who made rounds at regular intervals. Someone familiar with workhouse operations in general could have applied that knowledge at either location, which suggested the perpetrator had either worked in multiple institutions or had studied them carefully enough to understand their common vulnerabilities. The word that began to circulate, first in police circles and then in the press, was one that had not been spoken in London for half a century: resurrectionist. The newspapers seized upon the term with enthusiasm, printing lurid accounts of the body snatchers who had once terrorised the city, digging up fresh graves to supply medical schools with cadavers for dissection. The resurrection men had been creatures of shadow and greed, operating in gangs, bribing cemetery workers, even committing murder when grave robbery proved insufficient to meet demand. They had become legendary figures in London's criminal history, their trade ending only with the passage of the Anatomy Act that gave medical institutions legal access to unclaimed bodies. But were the resurrectionists truly gone, or had they simply adapted to new circumstances? The question haunted both police investigators and the public imagination. If someone was stealing organs rather than whole bodies, perhaps it represented a new form of the old trade, a modern resurrection practice adapted to changed laws and medical advances. The newspapers published historical accounts of famous body snatchers, Burke and Hare in Edinburgh, Bishop and Williams in London, reminding readers of the horrors that had once been commonplace in the pursuit of anatomical knowledge. Ashford found himself investigating the history of resurrection as thoroughly as he investigated the current crimes. He visited the Royal College of Surgeons, consulting with physicians who remembered the old days when medical students had been forced to rely on illegal cadaver suppliers. He learnt that the resurrection trade had involved elaborate networks of criminals, graveyard workers, and corrupt officials all profiting from the medical profession's need for bodies to study. The trade had been organised and sophisticated, with established prices for different types of cadavers and regular suppliers who maintained relationships with anatomy schools. Could such a network still exist? The physicians Ashford consulted were sceptical. The Anatomy Act had eliminated the market for stolen bodies by providing legal alternatives. Medical schools now received unclaimed bodies from workhouses, prisons and hospitals, with proper paperwork and official oversight. There was no longer any need for illegal suppliers, no financial incentive for resurrection work, and yet the violations continued, suggesting some motive beyond simple profit. One elderly surgeon Ashford interviewed offered a different perspective. Dr. James Whitmore had been a student in the 1820s, before the Anatomy Act, when resurrection men had been a necessary evil in medical education. He remembered buying cadavers from suppliers who delivered them wrapped in sacks, no questions asked about where they had originated or how recently they had been interred. He also remembered something else, that among the resurrection men there had been a few who seemed to engage in the trade not for money, but for darker reasons, men who showed too much interest in the bodies themselves, who lingered to watch dissections, who asked questions about anatomy that went beyond simple curiosity. Whitmore suggested that perhaps the current crimes represented not commercial resurrection, but something more psychological, someone with medical knowledge who was drawn to the dead in ways that transcended professional or financial interest. Such individuals had existed in every era, he explained, though they were rarely identified or stopped. The boundary between legitimate medical study and pathological obsession was sometimes difficult to discern, particularly in the early stages when someone's interest might appear merely enthusiastic rather than disturbed. This theory troubled Ashford deeply because it made the investigation much more difficult. If the motive was psychological rather than financial, then the perpetrator might be anyone with anatomical knowledge and access to workhouses, a medical student pursuing some private study, a physician exploring interests beyond his legitimate practice, even a former medical worker who retained knowledge and skills from earlier employment. The field of suspects became vast, encompassing hundreds of individuals across London who possessed the necessary abilities. Ashford began visiting medical schools and hospitals, not just to inquire about missing instruments or suspicious students, but to understand better the culture of anatomical study and whether it might produce individuals capable of the crimes he was investigating. He attended lectures on dissection technique, observed anatomy demonstrations, spoke with students and faculty about their work. What he learned was both reassuring and disturbing. Medical education was rigorous and well regulated, with clear ethical standards about the treatment of cadavers, but it also attracted individuals with varying motivations, some purely scientific and some darker, drawn to the study of death and the interior landscape of the human body in ways that might not be entirely healthy. One anatomy professor at Guy's Hospital spoke candidly about the challenges of identifying students whose interest in dissection went beyond appropriate bounds. There were always a few, he explained, who seemed too eager for the work, who spent extra hours in the dissection rooms, who showed fascination with the procedures that exceeded normal academic interest. Most such students were simply dedicated to learning, but occasionally one would emerge whose behaviour raised concerns, taking specimens without permission, conducting unauthorised dissections, showing too much emotion or too little when handling human remains. Had any such students been associated with Guy's in recent years? The professor consulted records going back a decade, identifying 3 students who had been counselled or disciplined for inappropriate behaviour in anatomy courses. One had been expelled for stealing preserved organs from the teaching collection. Another had been warned multiple times about spending unauthorised night hours in the dissection rooms. The third had been asked to leave after displaying what faculty considered an unhealthy emotional response to dissection work, alternating between excessive enthusiasm and disturbing detachment. Ashford tracked down all 3 individuals. The first was now practicing medicine in Manchester, far from London, with documented proof of his whereabouts during the workhouse violations. The second had died 2 years earlier in a railway accident. The third, a man named Edward Thorne, proved more interesting. He had completed his medical training despite the concerns about his behaviour, had worked briefly at a charity hospital in Southwark, and had then disappeared from medical directories. No current address, no listed employment, no trace in the professional community. Finding Thorne became a priority. Ashford assigned Detective Sergeant Bennett to search for any record of the man. Housing registrations, employment records, hospital credentials, anything so that might indicate his current location. The search consumed weeks, following leads through London's vast administrative records. Thorne had lived in at least 4 different lodgings over the past 3 years, never staying long in any location. He had held temporary positions at various institutions, an asylum in Hampstead, a private hospital in Kensington, a charity clinic in Whitechapel. None of his employers had kept him long, citing various reasons. Poor attendance, difficulty working with colleagues, inappropriate behaviour toward patients. By August, Bennett had located Thorne's most recent address, a lodging house in Spitalfields, barely a mile from both workhouses where violations had occurred. The landlady remembered him as a quiet tenant who kept strange hours, sometimes absent for days, sometimes locked in his room for equal periods. He had left 2 months earlier, owing rent, taking his belongings in the night without notice. The room had contained nothing of interest when the landlady cleaned it for the next tenant. Just stains on the floor she had attributed to spilled lamp oil, though now in retrospect she wondered if they might have been something else. Ashford interviewed Thorne's former employers, building a profile of a man whose medical career had disintegrated through a combination of professional incompetence and personal instability. Multiple supervisors described him as knowledgeable about anatomy but unable to function in normal medical practice, too isolated and strange to work effectively with patients or colleagues. One physician who had supervised Thorne at the Hampstead Asylum recalled that he had shown excessive interest in the post-mortem examinations conducted when patients died, volunteering to assist with procedures that other staff found distasteful. The profile fit the crimes disturbingly well. Medical knowledge, anatomical skill, social isolation, pattern of employment at charitable institutions serving the poor, familiarity with workhouse procedures through his various positions. But Ashford also recognised that a profile was not evidence, that fitting a pattern did not constitute proof of guilt. He needed to find Thorne, to question him, to determine whether the man's strange behaviour reflected criminal activity or simply the sad decline of someone unsuited to medical practice. The search expanded across London, with Thorne's description circulated to police stations and constables throughout the metropolitan area. Ashford visited every medical institution, every anatomy school, every place where someone with surgical skills might seek work or access to facilities. He showed Thorne's photograph, obtained from Guy's hospital records, to workhouse staff at institutions across the city. Some thought they recognised him. Others were uncertain. None could provide definite confirmation that he had been present at their facilities. September arrived with autumn chill and shorter days. The investigation had consumed 6 months, generated hundreds of pages of reports, involved dozens of officers and countless hours of work. Yet the perpetrator remained unidentified. Thorne remained unfound, and the workhouses remained vulnerable. 3 more violations were reported during August at 3 different institutions: Lambeth, Shoreditch, and Paddington. Each showed the same surgical precision, the same systematic organ removal, the same pattern of nighttime access to locked morgues. The crimes had become a regular occurrence, a monthly horror that the poor law system seemed powerless to prevent. The newspapers demanded answers. The Board of Guardians demanded protection. The public demanded that someone, anyone, be arrested and charged. Ashford felt the pressure from all directions but refused to make an arrest without solid evidence. Better to have an unsolved case than to charge an innocent man, he told his superiors, though he knew that position would not remain tenable indefinitely. The Metropolitan Police needed results, needed to demonstrate competence and control, needed to restore public confidence that had been shaken by their failure to stop the violations. And then, in late September, a breakthrough emerged from an unexpected source. Not evidence that would lead to an arrest, but information that would reshape Ashford's understanding of the crimes entirely. A physician from the London hospital came forward with a theory about what the perpetrator might be doing with the stolen organs, a theory so disturbing that it had taken weeks for him to convince himself to share it with police. The organs, he suggested, were not being sold or used for medical study or disposed of carelessly. They were being kept, preserved, collected with purpose. And if that was true, then somewhere in London there existed a private collection of human remains taken from the workhouse dead, a hidden repository of stolen organs that represented months of systematic violation. Finding that collection, the physician argued, would lead directly to the perpetrator. But where would someone hide such things, and how would they preserve them, and what possible purpose could such a collection serve? Chapter 6. The pattern emerges. The physician's name was Dr. Samuel Hendricks, and he specialised in pathology at the London hospital, spending his days examining diseased tissue and conducting post-mortem investigations to determine causes of death. He had followed the workhouse violations in the newspapers with professional interest, initially dismissing them as isolated incidents or the work of a deranged individual without larger significance. But as the cases accumulated through the summer months, as the pattern of surgical precision and systematic organ removal became clear, he began to recognise something familiar in the methodology. Hendricks contacted Ashford in late September, requesting a private meeting to discuss the case. They met at the London hospital in Hendricks' office, a small room lined with medical texts and glass jars containing preserved specimens. Hendricks was a man of 50 years, balding and heavy-set, with the careful manner of someone accustomed to dealing with uncomfortable truths. He began by explaining his specialty, the study of disease pathology, the examination of organs to understand how illness progressed and what damage it caused to human tissue. In his work, Hendricks regularly removed organs from bodies, preserved them in alcohol or formalin solution, stored them for extended study, and sometimes displayed them in medical museums or teaching collections. The process required knowledge, equipment, and purpose. Random theft of organs made no sense, but systematic collection with intent to preserve and study, that was different. That suggested someone building a private pathology collection, perhaps for research purposes, or perhaps for reasons more disturbing. Hendricks had brought this theory to Ashford for several reasons. First, the organs being taken from workhouse bodies were not random, but specific. Hearts, lungs, livers, kidneys, the major organs most useful for pathological study. Second, the surgical technique evident in police reports suggested someone trained in a dissection who understood how to remove organs intact rather than simply cutting tissue. Third, the frequency of violations, roughly monthly by late summer, suggested systematic collection rather than opportunistic theft. Someone was building a collection methodically, adding to it regularly, maintaining a private repository of specimens. If this theory was correct, Hendricks explained, then the perpetrator needed certain resources. Preservation required chemical solutions, alcohol, formalin, or other fixatives. Storage required glass containers of appropriate size, cork stoppers, possibly metal frames or shelving to organise the collection. The work required space where organs could be processed without interruption, where chemical odours would not attract attention, where the collection could be kept secure. All of this suggested either a medical facility where such resources existed naturally, or a private location where someone had assembled the necessary equipment. Ashford listened with growing interest. The theory explained aspects of the crimes that had troubled him, the systematic nature of the violations, the careful surgical work, the complete absence of organs at crime scenes. If someone was preserving specimens rather than selling them or discarding them, then the organs would have value to the perpetrator beyond their immediate theft. They would represent an accumulating collection, a private museum of human pathology, possibly the lifework of someone who could not pursue such study through legitimate medical channels. The question became how to locate such a collection. Hendricks suggested several approaches. First, investigate suppliers of medical equipment and preservation chemicals, looking for recent purchases by individuals not associated with recognized institutions. Second, examine property records for spaces that might serve as private laboratories, basement rooms, isolated workshops, abandoned buildings. Third, consider former medical students or physicians who had lost positions or failed to establish practices, individuals who might maintain anatomical interests outside professional contexts. Ashford assigned Bennett to investigate chemical suppliers across London. The task proved more difficult than anticipated. Multiple companies sold alcohol and formalin for various purposes beyond medical preservation, industrial uses, pharmaceutical manufacturing, even household applications. Sales records were incomplete or non-existent, particularly for small transactions paid in cash. Still, Bennett compiled lists of recent purchasers, focusing on individuals rather than institutions, looking for patterns that might indicate someone assembling preservation supplies. One supplier in Clerkenwell remembered a customer who had made regular purchases of formalin solution over several months, always paying cash, never providing information about intended use. The description was vague. A man of middle years, plainly dressed, quiet in manner, possibly educated based on his vocabulary. The supplier had noticed nothing suspicious at the time, but in retrospect the regular purchases and lack of explanation seemed unusual. Unfortunately, no name had been recorded, no address taken, nothing that would allow Bennett to trace the purchaser. Ashford expanded the investigation to include glass suppliers and manufacturers of laboratory equipment. Here the search proved more fruitful. A supplier in Southwark had sold 12 large specimen jars to a customer who identified himself as a private collector of natural history specimens. The transaction had occurred in July, paid in cash, with the jars delivered to an address in Bermondsey. The supplier still had the delivery record in his files. The address was a warehouse district near the river, an area of commercial buildings and storage facilities where questions were rarely asked and privacy was easily maintained. Ashford and Bennett visited the location on a grey October morning, finding a 3-storey brick structure divided into rental spaces used by various small businesses and craftsmen. The landlord consulted his records, identifying the space rented to the name given by the jar purchaser, Edward Thorne. The connection sent energy through the investigation. Thorne, the failed medical student with anatomical knowledge and strange behaviour, had rented space in Bermondsey and purchased specimen jars through a supplier. The evidence remained circumstantial, but the pattern was becoming clearer. Ashford obtained permission from the landlord to enter Thorne's rented space, a basement room accessible through exterior stairs descending from street level. The room was locked with a substantial padlock, new and heavy, far more security than other tenants employed. Ashford had the authority to force entry, but he proceeded carefully, aware that anything found inside would need to withstand legal scrutiny if charges were eventually filed. A locksmith was summoned to open the padlock without damaging it, preserving evidence of how the space had been secured. The work took 20 minutes, the locksmith working with careful tools while Ashford and Bennett waited in the autumn chill. When the door finally swung open, the smell emerged first. Chemical preservation, sharp and medicinal, unmistakable to anyone familiar with anatomical facilities. Ashford lit a lantern and stepped inside, Bennett following close behind. The room was approximately 15 feet square, windowless except for a small grate near the ceiling, providing minimal ventilation. Against one wall stood shelving constructed from rough lumber, and on those shelves sat rows of glass jars filled with yellowish liquid. In the liquid, suspended and preserved, were human organs. Ashford counted slowly, documenting what he saw. 18 jars, each containing one or more specimens. Hearts, lungs, livers, kidneys, sections of intestine, pieces of tissue he could not immediately identify. Labels had been attached to each jar, written in precise handwriting, noting what Ashford assumed were dates and possibly sources, though the abbreviations made complete interpretation difficult. Against another wall stood a wooden table with what appeared to be surgical instruments. Scalpels, bone saws, clamps, forceps. all clean and neatly arranged as if in preparation for future use. The room contained other items as well. Medical texts, anatomy charts, notebooks, filled with observations written in the same precise hand as the jar labels. A camp bed in one corner suggested Thorne sometimes slept in the space. A small spirit stove indicated he prepared basic meals there. The room functioned as both laboratory and living quarters, a private domain where someone had been conducting unauthorized anatomical study away from any institutional oversight or professional supervision. Bennett searched the notebooks while Ashford examined the specimens. The writings revealed a mind focused entirely on anatomical pathology, documenting observations about diseased organs, comparing specimens, developing theories about how illness progressed through different types of tissue. The tone was clinical, detached, showing no awareness that the specimens had been obtained through violation of the dead or theft from public institutions. Thorne wrote as if conducting legitimate research, as if his collection represented normal medical inquiry rather than criminal activity. One notebook contained a different sort of writing, more personal, revealing something of Thorne's mental state. He described his frustration with medical institutions that had rejected him. His belief that his work was important regardless of how he obtained specimens, his conviction that the pauper dead served society better by contributing to anatomical knowledge than by simply being buried in unmarked graves. The writing showed rationalization of criminal behavior, but also genuine belief that what he was doing had value, that his collection and study advanced medical understanding, even if conducted outside legitimate channels. The discovery of Thorne's laboratory provided evidence, but not the man himself. The room showed no signs of recent use. Dust had settled on the surgical instruments. The spirit stove was cold. The camp bed had not been slept in for some time, its blanket folded neatly and undisturbed. Thorne had not been present for days, possibly weeks. Either he had become aware of the investigation and abandoned the space, or he had simply moved on to another location, establishing a new laboratory elsewhere in the city. Ashford ordered the room sealed as a crime scene. The specimens would be examined by police physicians to determine if they matched organs reported missing from workhouse violations. The notebooks would be analysed for any clues about Thorne's current location or plans for future activity. The surgical instruments would be tested for traces that might definitively link them to specific crimes. But even with this evidence, Ashford knew the case remained incomplete. He had found the collection, proven the violations were systematic and purposeful, but the perpetrator remained free to continue his work. The newspapers learned of the discovery within days, as they always did. The coverage was sensational, focused on the horror of the private laboratory and its collection of stolen organs. Editorials demanded that Thorne be found and prosecuted with full severity. The medical profession expressed outrage that one of their own, however failed, had committed such violations. The workhouses implemented even stricter security, though everyone understood that determined criminals would find ways around any precautions. October passed into November as with no sign of Thorne. His description was distributed to every police station, posted in medical districts, shown to landlords and suppliers across London. Reports came in regularly of sightings, which he investigated and found to be mistaken identity or deliberate misinformation. Thorne had effectively vanished, either leaving London entirely or going to ground so thoroughly that normal police methods could not locate him. But the violations continued. 3 more cases in October, 2 in November, each at different workhouses, each showing the same surgical precision. The pattern suggested Thorne was not fleeing, but simply being more careful, varying his targets, taking fewer risks, maintaining his collection despite the police investigation. Somewhere in London, perhaps in another rented room or basement laboratory, the work continued. Organs accumulating in preservation jars, a criminal pursuit of anatomical knowledge that seemed impossible to stop. Ashford found himself reviewing the case obsessively, searching for some detail that might reveal Thorne's location or predict his next target. The man was clearly intelligent, medically trained, able to move through London without detection despite active police searches. He needed access to workhouses, required sources of preservation chemicals, had to have space for his laboratory. These requirements should have limited his options, made him findable. Yet week after week passed with no progress, no breakthroughs, just the steady accumulation of new violations and growing frustration among investigators and public alike. In late November, Ashford received a letter, delivered to Scotland Yard and addressed to him personally. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper covered in the same precise handwriting he had seen in Thorne's notebooks. The letter was brief, almost formal, explaining that the work being conducted was important medical research, that the specimens being collected represented valuable pathological data, that no harm was being done to anyone since the subjects were already deceased. The letter concluded by suggesting that police resources would be better spent on actual crimes rather than pursuing someone whose only offence was advancing medical knowledge through unconventional means. The letter was postmarked from East London but provided no other clues about Thorne's location. Ashford recognised it as both explanation and taunt, an attempt by Thorne to justify his actions while demonstrating that he remained beyond police reach. The psychological portrait it provided was troubling, a man who genuinely believed his criminal activity was justified, who saw himself as a misunderstood researcher rather than a violator of the dead, who had no intention of stopping regardless of police efforts. The investigation entered its 9th month with the case still unresolved. Ashford had evidence, had theories, had a suspect identified and described. But he did not have the man himself, and until Thorne was apprehended, the violations would continue, the workhouse dead would remain vulnerable, and London would live with the knowledge that somewhere in its vast expanse, a failed medical student was conducting unauthorized anatomical research on stolen organs, building a private collection that represented months of systematic criminal activity. The question was no longer whether Thorne could be found, but whether he would make a mistake that would finally allow his capture, or whether he would simply continue his work indefinitely, a shadow figure in London's medical underworld, pursuing his vision of anatomical study without regard for law or ethics or the dignity of the dead. Chapter 7. The Hospital Connection. December brought frost to London, ice forming on the Thames, breath visible in the air, and a cold that penetrated even the thickest clothing. In the workhouses, the winter months always brought increased mortality as the elderly and ill succumbed to respiratory infections that their weakened bodies could not fight. The morgues filled more quickly, burials occurred more frequently, and these opportunities for someone like Thorne to continue his work multiplied with each death in the crowded wards. Detective Inspector Ashford had spent weeks considering the letter from Thorne, analysing its tone and content for insights into the man's thinking. One phrase in particular had caught his attention: advancing medical knowledge through unconventional means. The phrase suggested Thorne still saw himself as part of the medical community, still identified with the profession that had rejected him, still believed his work had legitimate scientific value. If that was true, then perhaps Thorne maintained connections to medical institutions, perhaps he still sought validation from former colleagues or instructors, perhaps he was not as isolated from the professional world as the investigation had assumed. This line of thinking led Ashford back to Guy's Hospital, where Thorne had trained years earlier. He arranged a meeting with the anatomy professor who had first identified Thorne as a problematic student, hoping that additional details about Thorne's time at the institution might reveal patterns or connections that could aid the investigation. The professor, Dr. Marcus Webb, received Ashford in his office overlooking the hospital courtyard, a space filled with anatomical texts and preserved specimens similar to those found in Thorne's hidden laboratory. Webb remembered Thorne clearly, despite years having passed since the student's departure from Guy's. Some students were forgotten immediately, Webb explained, but others left impressions that persisted, usually for very good or very bad reasons. Thorne had been memorable for his intensity, his almost obsessive focus on anatomical study to the exclusion of other aspects of medical education. While other students balanced their time between anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, and clinical practice, Thorne had devoted himself almost exclusively to dissection and the study of human structure. This single-minded focus had initially appeared positive. Anatomy was fundamental to medical practice, and students who mastered it thoroughly were generally better physicians. But with Thorne, the interest had seemed to exceed normal academic dedication. He spent unauthorized hours in the dissection rooms, often arriving before dawn and remaining after other students had left. He had been found on several occasions working alone with cadavers when no instruction was scheduled, conducting his own investigations without faculty supervision. When questioned about this behaviour, he had insisted he was simply studying, trying to understand anatomical variations and pathological changes better than the formal curriculum allowed. The breaking point had come during Thorne's third year, when faculty discovered he had been taking specimens without permission, small pieces of tissue, sections of organs, samples he claimed were for private study. The thefts were documented, confronted, and Thorne was given a warning that further unauthorized taking of specimens would result in expulsion. He had complied for several months, then been caught again, this time with a preserved heart he had removed from the teaching collection and hidden in his personal locker. The incident had led to a disciplinary hearing where faculty debated whether Thorne should be expelled or allowed to continue with severe restrictions. The decision had ultimately been to let him finish his degree, but with close supervision and a formal notation in his academic record about the incidents. Webb believed this had been a mistake in retrospect. Thorne should have been expelled, should have been prevented from entering medical practice, should have received intervention to address whatever compulsion drove his behaviour. Instead, he had been allowed to graduate, had received his medical credentials, and had gone on to commit the crimes that now occupied Ashford's investigation. Webb provided additional information about Thorne's time at Guy's that proved relevant to the case. Thorne had been particularly interested in pathological anatomy, the study of diseased organs and how illness altered tissue structure. He had spent time in the hospital morgue observing post-mortem examinations, had asked detailed questions about preservation techniques, had shown fascination with the specimens kept in the pathology museum. This interest had not seemed unusual at the time. Many medical students developed the specialised interest during their training. But combined with the specimen thefts and Thorne's later criminal behaviour, it painted a picture of someone whose professional interests had crossed boundaries into obsession. More significantly, Webb revealed that Thorne had maintained contact with Guy's Hospital even after completing his training and leaving for other positions. He had visited several times, always asking to see the pathology collection, sometimes bringing questions about specific anatomical findings. The last visit had been approximately 18 months earlier, shortly before the workhouse violations began. Webb had spoken with Thorne briefly during that visit, noting that he seemed thinner and more dishevelled than during his student years, but still intensely focused on anatomical questions. Had Thorne mentioned where he was working at that time? Webb consulted notes from the visit, finding that Thorne had claimed to be doing research independently, not employed by any specific institution. He had asked about techniques for preserving organs in private settings without access to institutional resources, questions Webb had answered without suspecting anything criminal. In retrospect, those questions took on sinister significance. Thorne had been planning his private laboratory, gathering information about preservation methods he would later use on stolen organs. Ashford asked whether Thorne had formed any particular friendships during his time at Guy's, any relationships that might have persisted after his departure. Webb recalled that Thorne had been largely solitary, not socialising with other students, but he had developed a connection with one of the hospital staff, a preceptor named James Mitchell, who prepared cadavers for anatomy demonstrations and maintained the dissection rooms. The relationship had been based on shared interest in anatomical work, with Mitchell appreciating Thorne's dedication and sometimes allowing him access to dissection materials outside normal hours. Mitchell still works at Guy's, now serving as senior prosector with responsibility for the hospital's anatomical facilities. Ashford requested an immediate interview, and Webb arranged it, sending a porter to summon Mitchell from the dissection rooms. Mitchell arrived within minutes, a man of 60 years with the weathered hands and careful manner of someone who had spent decades working with the dead. He wore a leather apron stained with old blood and chemical preservatives, his sleeves rolled to reveal forearms marked by countless small scars from knives and bone saws. Yes, Mitchell remembered Edward Thorne well. A promising student, very serious about anatomical study, more interested in the work than most medical students who often found dissection distasteful. Mitchell had helped Thorne with various projects, had taught him preservation techniques, had even allowed him to assist with preparing demonstration specimens. They had maintained occasional contact after Thorne left Guy's, meeting perhaps 3 or 4 times over the years when Thorne returned to visit the hospital. When had they last met? Mitchell thought carefully, trying to recall. Perhaps 6 months earlier, maybe longer. Thorne had come to the dissection rooms asking for advice about a technical problem, how to preserve organs that showed advanced disease processes. Mitchell had suggested specific techniques, concentrations of preservatives, methods for maintaining tissue integrity despite pathological changes. Nothing about the conversation had seemed suspicious at the time. Mitchell had assumed Thorne was working at some medical institution and needed guidance for legitimate purposes. Ashford asked if Mitchell had any idea where Thorne might be now, and whether he had mentioned any location or employment. Mitchell shook his head, explaining that Thorne had always been vague about his circumstances, never providing details about where he lived or worked. But Mitchell volunteered something else. Thorne had mentioned difficulty obtaining surgical instruments, had asked whether Mitchell knew suppliers who sold to individuals rather than only to institutions. Mitchell had provided names of several shops in the medical district that might accommodate such purchases. This information proved valuable. Ashford sent Bennett to investigate these suppliers, showing Thorne's photograph and asking about recent purchase. 2 suppliers recognised him, confirming that Thorne had bought various surgical instruments over the past year: scalpels, forceps, bone saws, the tools needed for anatomical work. One supplier remembered Thorne asking about preservation chemicals, and had recommended a chemist in Whitechapel who sold formalin and alcohol in quantities suitable for private use. The chemist's shop was a small establishment in a narrow street near the London hospital, its windows displaying bottles of various compounds, and its interior smelling of sulphur and camphor. The proprietor was an elderly man named Solomon Katz, who had operated the business for 40 years, serving doctors, dentists, photographers, and various craftsmen who needed chemical supplies. Yes, he knew Edward Thorne, a regular customer who purchased formalin solution every few weeks. Thorne always paid cash, always took his purchases immediately, never ordered anything unusual beyond the preservatives, and occasionally distilled alcohol. Katz could not provide Thorne's current address, but he remembered something potentially useful. On his most recent visit, perhaps a month earlier, Thorne had mentioned needing to find new laboratory space because his previous location had become unsuitable. Katz had suggested he look in the area around the docks, where warehouse spaces could be rented cheaply, and landlords asked few questions about tenants' activities. Thorne had seemed interested in this advice, had asked specifically about the Limehouse district where commercial and residential areas overlapped and privacy was easily maintained. Limehouse was a district of narrow streets and ageing buildings along the Thames, known for its maritime trade, its immigrant communities, and its tolerance for questionable activities conducted behind closed doors. Ashford organised a systematic search of rental properties in the area, working with local constables who knew the district well. The search consumed several days, checking dozens of buildings, interviewing landlords and caretakers, looking for any space that might serve as Thorne's new laboratory. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a Chinese merchant who operated an import business in Limehouse and rented out basement rooms beneath his warehouse. He mentioned to a constable that one of his tenants matched the description being circulated, a quiet Englishman who paid rent promptly and kept to himself, often working late hours in the basement room he occupied. The tenant had given his name as Thomas Edwards, but the description and behaviour matched Thorne closely enough to warrant investigation. Ashford approached the location cautiously, bringing additional officers in case Thorne was present, and chose to resist arrest. The warehouse stood on a street leading down to the river, its brick walls blackened by decades of coal smoke, its windows overlooking a wharf where small vessels loaded and unloaded cargo. The Chinese merchant provided a key to the basement entrance, explaining that the tenant had requested privacy and rarely interacted with other occupants of the building. The basement room was similar to the Bermondsey location: stone walls, minimal ventilation, furnished with laboratory equipment and shelving for specimen jars. But this space showed recent use. The spirit stove was still warm, suggesting Thorne had been present within hours. The surgical instruments lay on the work table with fresh stains that had not yet been cleaned. Several new jars sat on the shelves, their contents clearly recent additions to Thorne's collection. And on the table, partially dissected, lay a human heart still dripping preservation fluid into a metal basin. But Thorne himself was not present. The room was empty, the door locked from outside, no sign of hurried departure or awareness of imminent discovery. Either Thorne had left on some errand and would return soon, or he had been warned somehow of the police investigation and had fled moments before their arrival. Ashford stationed officers nearby to watch for Thorne's return, while he examined the laboratory, documenting its contents and searching for any indication of where Thorne might go if he did not return to Limehouse. The notebooks found in this second laboratory revealed the progression of Thorne's work over recent months. The collection had grown to more than 30 specimens, each carefully documented with notes about pathological findings and comparative observations. The writing showed increasing sophistication in Thorne's analysis, suggesting he was developing genuine expertise in pathological anatomy despite his criminal methods of obtaining material. But the notebooks also revealed something more disturbing: a list of workhouses with notes about their security arrangements, accessibility of morgues, and patterns of staff movements. Thorne had been conducting systematic reconnaissance, planning future violations with the same care he applied to his anatomical studies. One workhouse appeared more frequently in the notes than others: St Bartholomew's in Clerkenwell, a large institution that Thorne had observed multiple times. His notes indicated he had identified vulnerabilities in their night security, had learned the schedule of burial details, had even sketched a map showing routes from the morgue to exterior doors. The level of planning suggested Thorne intended St Bartholomew's as his next target, possibly within days. Ashford made an immediate decision. Rather than wait for Thorne to return to Limehouse, he would set a trap at St Bartholomew's. The workhouse would be placed under surveillance, with officers positioned to observe the morgue and apprehend anyone attempting unauthorized access. If Thorne followed his pattern of regular collection, if he proceeded with his plan to violate St Bartholomew's, he would walk directly into police custody. It was a risk. Thorne might sense the trap, might abandon his plans, might simply disappear into London's vast population. But it represented the best chance to finally end the violations that had plagued the workhouse system for nearly a year. Chapter 8. The witnesses who saw nothing. The surveillance of St Bartholomew's workhouse began on the 15th of December, a Wednesday evening when darkness came early and fog rolled in from the Thames to settle over the city in thick grey layers. Detective Inspector Ashford positioned 6 officers around the institution, 2 watching the main entrance, 2 observing the rear courtyard where service doors provided access to basement areas, and 2 inside the building itself, disguised as temporary porters assisting with evening duties. The plan was to maintain this watch indefinitely, rotating officers every 12 hours, continuing until Thorne either appeared or abandoned his intention to target the workhouse. The workhouse master at St Bartholomew's was a man named Cornelius Drake, 20 years in poor law administration, experienced in managing institutions and familiar with the various irregularities that could occur in such places. He had read about the violations at other workhouses with professional concern, had implemented additional security measures at his own facility, and now found himself hosting a police operation he both welcomed and resented. Welcome because it might finally capture the perpetrator who had terrorized the workhouse system. Resented because it implied his institution was vulnerable, that his own security arrangements were insufficient to protect the dead in his care. Drake had been informed of Thorne's surveillance notes, had seen the sketches showing routes through his building, had learned that his workhouse had been studied and assessed by criminal eyes. The knowledge was unsettling, suggesting that Thorne had walked these corridors, had observed staff routines, had identified weaknesses that Drake himself had not recognised. Now Drake accompanied Ashford through the building, reviewing every entrance and exit, every route to the morgue, every point where an intruder might gain access. The morgue at St Bartholomew's occupied the northeast corner of the basement, accessible through interior corridors or through an exterior door that opened onto a covered stairwell descending from ground level. The exterior door was locked each evening at 8, with the key held by the night porter who made rounds every 2 hours. The interior access passed through a storage area where coal and supplies were kept, then along a narrow corridor to the morgue itself. Gas lamps in the corridor were extinguished after 10 to conserve fuel, leaving the basement in darkness except for whatever light the night porter carried during his rounds. Ashford positioned his interior officers in the storage area, where they could observe both the corridor to the morgue and the exterior door, without being visible to anyone approaching from either direction. They were provided with dark lanterns that could be opened to provide light only when needed, and instructions to remain silent and motionless unless Thorne appeared. The wait might be hours, might be days, might prove entirely fruitless if Thorne had sensed the trap or changed his plans. But Ashford had learned patience during his years investigating crimes, had developed the ability to wait through long cold nights for developments that might never come. The first night produced nothing. The officers maintained their positions from 8 in the evening until 6 in the morning, watching darkness and silence, observing the night porter's rounds at 10 and midnight and 2 and 4, seeing nothing unusual and no sign of Thorne. The morgue remained undisturbed, the 2 bodies it contained awaiting burial in the same condition they had been placed there the previous evening. The officers rotated off duty, exhausted and cold, replaced by fresh men who would watch through the following night. The second night was equally uneventful. December rain fell steadily, drumming on the roof and cascading, through downspouts, the sound filling the building and masking any smaller noises that might have indicated movement or intrusion. The officers in the storage area sat in darkness, listening to rain and the occasional creak of old timbers settling, alert but increasingly doubtful that Thorne would appear. Perhaps he had been warned. Perhaps he had abandoned his plans for St Bartholomew's. Perhaps the entire operation was futile. The third night began with the same rain, the same darkness, the same patient watching. The officers on duty were experienced men who had conducted surveillance before, who knew how to remain motionless for hours, who understood that police work often consisted of waiting through empty time for brief moments of action. They settled into their positions at 8, watched the porter lock the exterior door and begin his first round, then prepared for a long night of observation. Near midnight something changed. The officer watching the exterior door, a constable named William Hewitt, noticed movement in the stairwell outside, visible as shadow through the frosted glass panels set into the upper portion of the door. Someone was descending the stairs, moving slowly and carefully, trying to approach without making noise. Hewitt signalled his partner, Constable Davies, who moved silently to a position where he could see both the door and the corridor to the morgue. Both men waited, hands on their truncheons, ready to act but holding position as instructed, until they could confirm the intruder's identity and intentions. The door handle turned slowly, testing whether the door was locked. Finding it secured, the figure outside paused, then there came the sound of metal on metal, someone working on the lock with picks or tools. The process took several minutes, the lock mechanism resisting and then finally yielding with a soft click. The door opened inward, admitting cold air and rain smell, and a figure dressed in dark clothing with a scarf wrapped around the lower face. Hewitt and Davies waited until the figure had entered completely and closed the door, until there was no possibility of escape back through the exterior entrance. Then Hewitt opened his dark lantern, flooding the storage area with light. The figure froze, caught in the sudden illumination, one hand reaching toward the corridor leading to the morgue. For a moment no one moved, hunter and hunted suspended in the clarity that comes when plans meet reality and nothing proceeds as expected. The figure was not Edward Thorne. Hewitt realised this immediately, comparing the person before him to the description he had memorised from police circulars. This individual was shorter, slighter, dressed not in the gentleman's clothing Thorne might wear, but in working garments, rough wool trousers, a labourer's jacket, heavy boots. The face, partially visible above the scarf, was young, perhaps 20 years, with fair hair and features that showed more confusion than criminal intent. The young man raised his hand slowly, palms forward, universal gesture of surrender. His voice came muffled through the scarf. He was not there to cause trouble, he said. He was simply looking for a place to sleep, out of the rain, somewhere warm, where he would not be moved along by constables. The workhouse basement sometimes provided such shelter, he claimed. He had not realised it was secured, had picked the lock out of desperation rather than criminal purpose. Hewitt did not believe this explanation. Men seeking shelter did not pick locks with professional skill, did not carry the tools required for such work, did not move with the careful silence this intruder had displayed. But neither was this the perpetrator they sought. Hewitt detained the young man, searching him for weapons and finding none, discovering only lock-picks and a small knife of the sort many working men carried. Davies went to summon Ashford from his position near the main entrance, while Hewitt questioned the intruder about his presence and purpose. The young man's story shifted under interrogation. He admitted he had not been seeking shelter, but had been sent to check whether the basement was accessible, whether the door could be opened, whether anyone was watching. Sent by whom? The young man hesitated, clearly weighing his options, then named someone called Jack, who sometimes hired him for various tasks requiring lock, picking, or other skills of questionable legality. Where could this Jack be found? The young man provided an address in Clerkenwell, a lodging house where Jack reportedly lived, though he emphasised he barely knew the man and had simply been offered money to test the workhouse security. Ashford arrived and took over the questioning, his tone firm but not threatening, encouraging cooperation through promise of leniency rather than fear of punishment. The young man, he gave his name as Thomas Birch, gradually revealed more. Jack had hired him 3 days earlier, paying 2 shillings to pick the workhouse lock and report back whether anyone interfered. Jack had not explained why he wanted this information, but Birch had assumed it related to theft of supplies or equipment stored in the basement, not understanding the true purpose until now. Could Birch describe Jack? The description that emerged was more detailed than previous accounts of Thorne, but still not definitive. A man of perhaps 40 years, average height and build, well-spoken but wearing working clothes, educated in manner but not wealthy in appearance, someone who could move between social classes without attracting particular attention in either context. The description could fit Thorne, or could fit thousands of other men in London, not distinctive enough to confirm identity, but consistent with what was known. Ashford made a decision quickly. He would send officers to the Clerkenwell address immediately, while maintaining surveillance at St Bartholomew's in case Thorne appeared, regardless of Birch's capture. Birch himself would be detained as a witness and potential accomplice, held at the local police station pending further investigation. The young man accepted this outcome with resignation, seeming more relieved than upset, as if arrest was preferable to returning to whoever had hired him with news of failure. The Clerkenwell address proved to be a common lodging house of the sort that housed dozens of temporary residents, men who paid nightly for a bed and asked no questions about their neighbours' business. The proprietor consulted his register, identifying a man matching the description who had taken a room under the name John Collins 3 days earlier. The room was on the 3rd floor, accessed by narrow stairs that creaked with every step, overlooking an alley rather than the street. 4 officers approached the room in the early morning hours, moving as quietly as the building's construction allowed. The door was locked but not substantially secured, yielding to a shoulder strike that sent it crashing inward. The room beyond was empty. A narrow bed with rumpled blankets, a small table holding a cold oil lamp, nothing else. No personal belongings, no clothing, no indication who had occupied the space or where they might have gone. The proprietor could provide no useful information beyond confirming that the tenant had paid through the end of the week and had been present the previous evening but had not been seen since. The surveillance at St Bartholomew's continued through the remainder of December with no further incidents. No one else attempted to access the basement. No suspicious individuals were observed near the workhouse. No violations occurred at the morgue. Either Thorne had learned of Birch's capture and decided the workhouse was now too risky to target, or he had never intended to use Birch's reconnaissance for immediate action, instead gathering information for future reference. Ashford maintained the watch through Christmas and into the new year, but by mid-January he was forced to acknowledge that the operation had failed to achieve its primary objective. Thomas Birch was questioned repeatedly during his detention, asked to recall every detail of his interaction with the man who called himself Jack. But Birch had met him only twice, once when hired, once when given the workhouse assignment, and could provide nothing beyond the general description already documented. He knew nothing about where Jack lived, what he did for income, or why he wanted information about workhouse security. The relationship had been purely transactional, money exchanged for services rendered, no personal information shared on either side. The investigation expanded to include other young men with lock-picking skills, the criminal network of petty thieves and burglars who might be hired for reconnaissance work. Ashford's theory was that Thorne had been using intermediaries, avoiding personal risk by sending others to test security and gather information. If this was true, there might be other men like Birch who had been hired for similar tasks at different workhouses, men who might provide additional descriptions or details that could help locate Thorne. This line of investigation produced several promising leads. A burglar known as Jimmy Shaw admitted he'd been hired months earlier to observe the night routines at a workhouse in Lambeth, recording times when porters made rounds and when the building was least watched. He had assumed the information would be used for theft of supplies or equipment, not understanding the true purpose until questioned by police. His description of the man who hired him matched earlier accounts: educated, well-spoken, average appearance, using the false name of James Watson. Another criminal, a man who specialized in entering buildings through upper windows, recalled being asked to determine whether a workhouse in Shoreditch could be accessed through the roof. He had surveyed the building, reported back that roof access was possible but difficult, and had been paid 5 shillings for his work. The man who hired him had given no name at all, had worn spectacles and a beard that might have been false, and had spoken with the careful diction of someone educated beyond the working class. The pattern became clear. Thorne was conducting systematic reconnaissance of workhouses across London, hiring various individuals to gather information without revealing his identity or purpose. He was working methodically, patiently, building knowledge about multiple institutions so he could select targets based on vulnerability rather than simply attempting random violations. This approach explained why he had evaded capture for so long. He minimized his personal exposure, used intermediaries who knew nothing about his ultimate intentions, and never established predictable patterns that police could anticipate. But it also provided a potential vulnerability. If Thorne continued hiring reconnaissance agents, eventually one of them might provide information that would lead directly to him. Someone might demand payment at a location he frequented, might follow him to learn where he lived, might remember details that seemed insignificant but that would allow identification. Ashford circulated word through the criminal networks of London that information about the man hiring reconnaissance work would be rewarded with substantial payment and immunity from prosecution for related offences. It was an unusual approach, essentially bribing criminals to betray their employer, but Ashford had exhausted more conventional methods. The offer produced results within weeks. A fence who dealt in stolen goods reported that one of his regular customers had mentioned being hired to watch a workhouse, had complained that the man who hired him was strange and made him uncomfortable, asking detailed questions about the dead and how bodies were handled. The fence could provide an address where payment had been delivered, not Thorne's residence, but a public house in Stepney where the man had appeared at a specified time to exchange money for information. Ashford stationed observers at the public house, hoping Thorne might use the location again for other transactions. The surveillance continued through February, with officers rotating through the establishment, posing as customers, watching for anyone matching Thorne's description or exhibiting suspicious behaviour. The work was tedious and often futile, but it represented one of the few active leads available, and Ashford was determined to pursue every possibility regardless of how slim the chances of success. On the 23rd of February, the patience was rewarded. A man matching Thorne's description entered the public house near 9 in the evening, ordered gin, and sat at a corner table watching the door as if expecting someone. 2 officers were present, positioned separately to avoid suggesting coordination. They observed the man carefully, noting his clothing, his manner, his movements. When a younger man entered and approached the corner table, when money and papers were exchanged, the officers moved simultaneously, blocking the exit and identifying themselves as police. The man at the table did not resist. He set down his glass carefully, placed his hands flat on the table where they could be seen, and waited for the officers to approach. Up close he bore some resemblance to the descriptions of Edward Thorne: average height, average build, educated bearing. But when asked his name, he provided identification documents showing he was Henry Matthews, a solicitor's clerk with no connection to medical training or anatomical interests. His business at the public house was entirely legal, he explained calmly. He was meeting an informant about a civil matter his employer was investigating, nothing related to workhouses or criminal activity. The young man confirmed this story, producing documents that supported Matthews' explanation. The papers exchanged had been legal testimony about a property dispute, nothing more. Ashford questioned both men extensively, but found no evidence connecting them to Thorne or the workhouse violations. It was another dead end, another false lead in an investigation that had consumed more than a year and produced no arrest, no resolution, only an accumulating weight of failed attempts and frustrated hopes. The witnesses who might have led to Thorne had seen nothing useful, remembered nothing definitive, provided nothing that would bridge the gap between knowledge of the crimes and capture of the criminal. Chapter 9. The Final Desecration. Spring arrived gradually in 1888, the winter cold loosening its grip through March and April, bringing longer days and warmer rain that washed some of the grime from London streets. In the workhouses, mortality rates declined as they always did when weather improved and respiratory infections became less common. The morgues received fewer bodies, burials occurred less frequently, and the opportunities for violation diminished accordingly. Yet the crimes continued, though with decreasing frequency. 1 incident in March, none in April, then 2 in May at workhouses in different parts of the city. Detective Inspector Ashford had been investigating the workhouse violations for more than a year, had followed countless leads to nowhere, had interviewed hundreds of people without identifying a definitive suspect, had conducted surveillances that produced no results. The case had consumed enormous police resources, had generated criticism from both superiors and the press, and had damaged Ashford's professional reputation. There were suggestions he should be removed from the investigation, that fresh eyes might see patterns or possibilities he had missed. But Ashford refused to relinquish the case, arguing that his accumulated knowledge represented the investigation's most valuable asset, that starting over with a new lead detective would mean months of wasted time. The truth was that Ashford had become obsessed with capturing Edward Thorne, with ending the violations that had terrorized the workhouse system and defiled the dead for so long. He thought about the case constantly, reviewed evidence during evenings at home, woke in the night with theories that seemed promising in darkness, but dissolved in morning light. His wife complained about his distraction. His children barely knew him anymore. His health had declined from too many cold nights on surveillance and too little proper rest. But he could not let go, could not accept that some crimes remained unsolved, that some criminals escaped justice simply by being careful and patient and lucky. In late August, Ashford received information that changed the direction of the investigation. A physician at the London hospital contacted Scotland Yard, reporting that one of his colleagues had mentioned something potentially relevant to the workhouse case. The colleague was Dr. Samuel Hendricks, the pathologist who had earlier provided the theory about organ collection. Hendricks had been attending a medical conference where informal conversations had turned to unusual cases and strange incidents. and another physician had described receiving a letter from a former medical student asking detailed questions about preservation techniques for diseased organs. The letter had seemed innocuous at the time, just a former student maintaining interest in anatomical pathology. But after hearing Ashford's presentation about the workhouse violations at the conference, the physician had realised the questions might be related. The student had identified himself as Edward Thorne, had provided a return address in Whitechapel, and had asked specifically about methods for preserving organs that showed advanced disease processes, exactly the sort of specimens being stolen from workhouse morgues. Ashford and Detective Sergeant Bennett travelled immediately to the Whitechapel address, a lodging house in a narrow court off Commercial Road. The building was typical of the area, 3 stories of ageing brick divided into small rooms rented by the week to workers, immigrants, prostitutes, and the various arsenal people who inhabited London's poorest districts. The landlady was a widow named Eleanor Marsh, a suspicious woman accustomed to dealing with tenants who often had reasons to avoid attention. Yes, she had a tenant named Edward Thorne, a quiet man who had rented a first-floor room for the past 4 months. He paid on time, caused no trouble, kept to himself. She saw him infrequently, sometimes not for days at a stretch, and had no idea what he did for income or how he occupied his time. The room he rented was modest, furnished only with a bed and table, and he had brought no possessions beyond a single trunk and some books. He had said nothing about his background or circumstances, had asked only that his privacy be respected, and that his mail be held at the door rather than delivered to his room. Ashford asked whether Thorne was currently in residence. Mrs. Marsh believed so, having seen him return the previous evening, carrying parcels that might have contained supplies or equipment. She provided a key to the room, accepting Ashford's assurance that the entry was legally authorised as part of a criminal investigation. The 3 of them, Ashford, Bennett and Mrs. Marsh, climbed the stairs to the first floor, approached the room at the end of a dim corridor, and prepared to finally confront the man who had eluded police for more than a year. Ashford knocked firmly, announcing himself as police and demanding the door be opened. No response came from within. He knocked again, louder, with the same lack of result. Using the key Mrs. Marsh had provided, he unlocked the door and pushed it open, Bennett beside him with truncheon ready in case Thorne chose to resist. The room was empty, not abandoned. The bed was made. Books sat stacked on the table. The trunk stood against one wall, but unoccupied at this moment. Ashford stepped inside, examining the space carefully. The books were medical texts, anatomy volumes, and pathology references of the sort any physician might own. The trunk, when open, contained clothing and personal items, but nothing obviously connected to the crimes. No surgical instruments, no preservation chemicals, no specimen jars or anatomical materials. A search of the room revealed more. Beneath the bed, wrapped in oilcloth, Ashford found a leather case containing scalpels, forceps, bone saws, and other surgical instruments, all clean but showing signs of regular use. In the trunk, hidden beneath clothing, were notebooks similar to those found in Thorne's previous laboratories, filled with anatomical observations and specimen descriptions, and most significantly, tucked into one of the books, Ashford discovered correspondence, letters from various physicians responding to Thorne's inquiries about pathological anatomy, providing information about techniques and theories without realising they were assisting criminal activity. The evidence was overwhelming, definitively linking this room to the workhouse violations. But Thorne himself remained absent, either by chance timing or because he had somehow learned of police interest and fled. Ashford stationed Bennett in the corridor to watch for Thorne's return while he conducted a more thorough search of the room and questioned Mrs. Marsh about her tenant's habits and schedule. Mrs. Marsh could provide little useful information. Thorne came and went at irregular hours, sometimes absent for entire days, sometimes present but secluded in his room. She had never seen him with visitors, had never heard him entertaining guests or conducting any business from the lodgings. He spoke politely when they encountered each other but volunteered nothing about his life or activities. She had assumed he was some sort of scholar or writer. the sort of educated person who sometimes lived in poor districts out of economic necessity or eccentricity. The surveillance of the lodging house continued for 3 days, with officers watching all exits, monitoring the street, prepared to arrest Thorne the moment he appeared. But he did not return. Either he had been present when Ashford knocked and had escaped through a window while they examined his room, or he had been elsewhere and had learned of the police presence through some informant or chance observation. Whatever the explanation, Thorne remained free, his room preserved as a crime scene, his possessions seized as evidence, but the man himself still beyond reach. Ashford expanded the search to the surrounding area, showing Thorne's photograph at shops and public houses, questioning residents of neighbouring buildings, searching for any indication of where Thorne might have gone. The effort produced scattered sightings, but nothing definitive. A shopkeeper thought he had seen someone matching the description 3 days earlier. A prostitute recalled a man of similar appearance who had walked past her pitch the previous week. A dock worker mentioned seeing someone who might have been Thorne near the river, watching the sets, but none of these sightings could be confirmed, and none provided information about Thorne's current location. Then on September 7th, a Friday evening when early autumn darkness was settling over the city, a violation occurred at the Whitechapel Workhouse, barely half a mile from the lodging house where Ashford had discovered Thorne's room. The incident was discovered immediately because it occurred not during night hours but in the early evening, when staff were still active throughout the building. The night porter, beginning his rounds earlier than usual, entered the morgue near 7 and found a figure bent over a body that had been delivered from the infirmary less than an hour earlier. The porter, a man named William Foster, shouted in alarm, and the figure turned toward him, scalpel in hand, face visible in the gaslight. Foster would later describe the encounter in detail: a man of average height dressed in dark clothing holding a surgical knife, with an expression not of fear or guilt but of intense concentration interrupted, like a scholar disturbed in the midst of important work. For a moment they stared at each other across the morgue, porter and intruder, both frozen by the suddenness of the confrontation. Then the figure moved, not toward the door Foster blocked, but toward a second exit on the opposite side of the room, a service entrance Foster had not known existed. The door opened onto a corridor that led to the workhouse chapel, and from there to an exterior door accessing the street. Foster ran after the fleeing figure but was not fast enough. By the time he reached the street, the intruder had disappeared into the evening crowds, lost among the hundreds of people moving through Whitechapel's busy thoroughfares. Foster returned to the morgue and examined what had been done. The body, a woman who had died that afternoon of heart failure, had been opened with the same precise incision characteristic of all the previous violations. But the work was incomplete, interrupted too early for organs to be removed. The surgical instruments lay on the examination table where the intruder had dropped them when Foster appeared. And on the floor near the service entrance, Foster found something the intruder had lost in his hasty departure: a leather wallet containing identification papers. The papers identified the owner as Edward Thorne, former student of Guy's Hospital, with an address in Stepney that proved to be false when police investigated. But the wallet also contained something more immediately useful: a receipt from a chemist's shop in Limehouse, dated that very afternoon, for purchase of formalin solution and distilled alcohol. The chemist remembered the transaction clearly when Ashford showed him Thorne's photograph. The customer had seemed agitated, had purchased more preservative than usual, and had mentioned needing to relocate his work to a more secure location. The chemist could not provide an address, but he mentioned that Thorne had arrived on foot from the direction of the docks, suggesting he was working or living in that area. Ashford organised an intensive search of the Limehouse dock district, checking every warehouse and storage building, every basement and vacant space that might serve as a laboratory. The search consumed days, involving dozens of officers combing through a maze of commercial buildings and maritime facilities. On September 10th, searchers found Thorne's final laboratory in a condemned warehouse scheduled for demolition. The building stood near the river, its windows broken, its roof partially collapsed, accessible through multiple breaches in its crumbling walls. In a basement room relatively protected from weather, police discovered the most extensive collection yet. More than 40 specimen jars arranged on makeshift shelving, surgical equipment laid out on a table constructed from salvaged lumber, and notebooks documenting a year and a half of anatomical study conducted on stolen organs. But once again, Thorne was absent. The laboratory showed no signs of recent use, no indication he had been present since the Whitechapel incident 3 days earlier. He had abandoned this location as he had abandoned others, moving on to protect himself, presumably establishing yet another laboratory somewhere else in the vast expanse of London. The pattern seemed destined to continue indefinitely, Thorne relocating each time discovery threatened, resuming his work at new locations, always staying one step ahead of the investigation. Yet this time something was different. Among the notebooks in the condemned warehouse, Ashford found what appeared to be a journal entry dated September the 7th, the day of the Whitechapel violation. The entry was unlike the clinical observations that filled the other notebooks, more personal and revealing of Thorne's mental state. He wrote about the increasing difficulty of his work, the constant need to relocate, the risk of each new violation. He expressed frustration that his research was not being recognised, that the medical establishment continued to reject him despite what he considered important contributions to pathological understanding. And most significantly, he wrote about feeling that his time was ending, that he could not continue much longer, that perhaps he should cease his work before inevitable capture and imprisonment destroyed everything he had accomplished. The entry concluded with a curious statement. "If this is to be my final contribution, let it be remembered that I sought only to advance knowledge, to understand disease and death more completely than conventional medicine allowed. Whatever judgment comes, I will face it knowing I pursued truth where others feared to look." Ashford read this passage multiple times, trying to extract meaning beyond the obvious. Was Thorne contemplating surrender? Was he planning to flee London entirely? Or was this simply another rationalization, another attempt to justify criminal behavior through claims of scientific purpose? The tone suggested finality, a sense of conclusion approaching, but whether that meant an end to the violations or some more dramatic resolution remained unclear. The Whitechapel incident proved to be the last documented violation. September passed with no new cases reported from any workhouse in London. October came with autumn rain and falling leaves and no further desecrations. November arrived with winter's first frost and continued silence from morgues across the city. The violations had simply stopped as suddenly and mysteriously as they had begun 18 months earlier. Ashford continued his investigation through the end of the year, but with decreasing intensity and growing awareness that the case might never be formally resolved. Thorne had vanished completely, leaving no trail, no indication of whether he had left London or simply gone so deeply to ground that police methods could not find him. The stolen organs, the surgical instruments, the notebooks, all had been recovered from his various laboratories, providing extensive evidence of his crimes, but no clue to his current whereabouts. Without the man himself, without arrest and trial and conviction, the case remained technically open, a failure that would mark Ashford's career despite his years of dedicated effort. Chapter 10. The Silence of the Grave. The winter of 1888 settled over London with unusual severity. Ice forming thick on the Thames, snow falling just in January, and lingering for weeks in the shadows of buildings and along the edges of streets. In the workhouses, the death rate increased, as it always did when cold penetrated the inadequate heating systems and found the weakest among the inmates. The very old, the very young, those whose bodies had been worn down by poverty and disease and years of marginal existence. The morgues filled with the winter dead, and they remained undisturbed, no violations occurring, no surgical desecrations discovered, only the normal procession of death and burial that characterized institutional life. Detective Inspector Ashford reviewed the workhouse case periodically through the winter months, searching for patterns he might have missed, considering theories about where Thorne might have gone and whether the cessation of violations meant permanent departure from criminal activity or simply a long pause before resumption. The question haunted him. Had Thorne stopped because capture seemed imminent, or had something else ended his work? Disease, injury, imprisonment for some unrelated crime. Even death itself might have intervened, removing the perpetrator from London without police knowledge or involvement. In February, Ashford received a letter at the Scotland Yard, anonymous, postmarked from Southampton, containing a single page of careful handwriting. The letter claimed to be from someone who had known Edward Thorne, who had been aware of his anatomical work, who wanted police to understand that Thorne's activities had ended permanently. The writer provided no details about how they knew this, offered no evidence beyond their assertion, but stated with apparent certainty that Thorne had left England aboard a merchant vessel in October, bound for Australia, where he hoped to establish a new life far from the institutions that had rejected him and the police who had pursued him. Ashford investigated the claim, contacting port authorities in Southampton and reviewing passenger manifests for October departures to Australia. Several ships had sailed that month, carrying hundreds of emigrants seeking new opportunities into the colonies. Passenger lists showed no one named Edward Thorne, but Ashford knew such records proved little. Thorne could have travelled under a false name, could have worked as crew rather than passenger, could have departed from a different port entirely. The anonymous letter might have been truthful, or might have been misdirection, designed to end the investigation by suggesting Thorne was safely distant and no longer a threat to London's workhouses. Without definitive evidence of Thorne's departure or continued presence, Ashford could only maintain the investigation in a reduced state, checking periodically for new violations, following up on occasional reports of sightings that invariably proved mistaken, and accepting gradually that formal resolution might never come. By spring, the case had been effectively closed as unsolved, though technically it remained open pending any new evidence that might emerge. Ashford was reassigned to other investigations, his year-and-a-half pursuit of Thorne relegated to the files of unsolved crimes that accumulated at Scotland Yard despite best efforts. The workhouses implemented security improvements that remained in place long after the immediate threat had passed. Morgues were checked more frequently, keys were more carefully controlled, night staff were given specific instructions about securing the dead and reporting any irregularities. The Poor Law Board issued guidelines for all institutions under their authority, establishing protocols designed to prevent future violations and ensure proper treatment of bodies awaiting burial. These reforms represented the only tangible outcome of the investigation, not justice or closure, but at least procedural changes that might protect against similar crimes. In the years that followed, occasional rumours surfaced about Edward Thorne, unverified reports that he had been seen in various locations, Australia as the anonymous letter had suggested, but also Canada, South Africa, even returned to England under a new identity. None of these reports could be confirmed, and most were probably simply cases of mistaken identity or wishful thinking by people who wanted to believe the mystery had been resolved. Thorne passed into the realm of London's unsolved cases, joining the ranks of criminals who had successfully evaded capture and disappeared into the vast anonymity that the modern world provided to those who wished to vanish. The stolen organs, preserved in their jars and held as evidence, were eventually destroyed by order of the courts, cremated in hospital incinerators rather than returned to workhouse graves. The surgical instruments were melted down, their metal reclaimed, erasing the physical tools of violation. The notebooks documenting Thorne's observations and theories were filed in police archives, where they remained available for study but were rarely consulted. The contents of interest only to the occasional researcher investigating the history of Victorian crime. Dr. Samuel Hendricks, the pathologist whose theories had helped shape the investigation, published a paper about the case in a medical journal, discussing it as an example of how anatomical knowledge could be misapplied by disturbed individuals. He argued that medical education needed to include not just technical training, but also ethical instruction about appropriate boundaries and professional responsibility. The paper generated some discussion within medical circles, but most physicians preferred not to dwell on the uncomfortable fact that one of their profession had committed such violations, choosing instead to treat Thorne as an aberration rather than a warning about potential pathologies within medical culture itself. Thomas Wickham, the porter at St George in the East who had first discovered a violation, continued his work at the workhouse for another decade before retiring. He rarely spoke about the case, finding that people were either too disturbed by the details or too fascinated in ways that made him uncomfortable. The memory of that dawn when he had raised his lantern to find bodies opened and emptied stayed with him, surfacing occasionally in dreams, a reminder that even institutional death, orderly and documented and routine, could be violated by those who saw the dead not as former people deserving respect, but as specimens to be studied and collected. Sarah Collins, the nurse who had interrupted a violation and confronted the intruder, left workhouse nursing after several years, finding that the incident had changed how she felt about the work. She had entered the profession believing she was providing care and comfort to the dying, helping them transition with dignity from life to death. But the violations had revealed that death did not necessarily end vulnerability, that the dead remained subject to harm from the living, and this knowledge troubled her in ways she could not quite articulate. She took a position at a private hospital where patients were fewer and better supervised, where death occurred less frequently, and the morgue was locked more securely. The workhouses themselves continued their operations through the remainder of the Victorian era and into the 20th century, processing poverty according to the principles of the Poor Law, separating families and imposing labour and providing minimal care until the system was finally reformed decades later. Thousands died in these institutions over the years, their bodies passing through the morgues and into paupers' graves, most forgotten entirely within a generation, their lives and deaths recorded only in registers that documented the simple facts of admission and departure without preserving anything of their individual humanity. In one of those registers, among the hundreds of names and dates and causes of death, there appeared an entry for an unidentified man who had died in November 1888 at the Limehouse workhouse. The record noted only that he had been found deceased in a condemned warehouse near the docks, that his body showed signs of malnutrition and exposure, and that no one had claimed him or provided information about his identity. He was buried in the usual manner, wrapped in a shroud and lowered into a common grave with others who had died that week, his presence in the world leaving no more mark than the dozens of others interred alongside him. Whether this unnamed dead man was Edward Thorne, whether he had died of cold and hunger in the same district where he had conducted his final laboratory, whether his obsessive pursuit of anatomical knowledge had ended not in Australia or elsewhere, but in a pauper's death and anonymous burial, these questions could not be answered with certainty. The timing was right, the location was plausible, and the irony would have been profound if the man who had violated so many workhouse dead had himself ended as a workhouse corpse, subject to the same institutional processing he had disrupted through his crimes. But certainty proved elusive, as it often did with Victorian crimes and Victorian deaths, where record-keeping was incomplete and identification was difficult, and the sheer number of people dying in poverty meant that many passed through the world without leaving traces that would allow later generations to confirm who they were, or how they lived, or what became of them. Thorne might have been that unnamed body in Limehouse, or he might have successfully escaped to another continent, or he might have lived out his years under a false identity, forever changed by his brief campaign of violation, but never prosecuted for those crimes. What remained certain was only this, that for 18 months in the late 1880s, someone had systematically violated the dead in London's workhouse morgues, had opened bodies with surgical skill and removed organs for preservation and study, had pursued anatomical knowledge through criminal means with dedication and method that suggested obsession rather than simple malice. The crimes had terrorized the poor law system, had consumed enormous police resources, had generated newspaper coverage and public concern and institutional reforms, and then they had stopped as suddenly as they had begun, leaving behind only evidence and theories and unanswered questions about the perpetrator's ultimate fate. The workhouses gradually emptied their morgues of the winter dead as spring arrived in 1889, conducting burial services and filling plots in the paupers' fields that surrounded these institutions. The earth received the poor as it always had, without ceremony or distinction, the graves unmarked except in ledgers that recorded numbers and dates but preserved nothing of individual identity. Among those buried that spring were the victims whose bodies had been violated, their remains finally laid to rest after being held as Yandin, evidence through the long investigation. They went into the ground incomplete, missing the organs that had been taken, their violation permanent and their desecration unresolved by justice or restitution. The seasons turned through summer and autumn and back to winter, life continuing in the patterns that characterize Victorian London, work and poverty and death and disposal, the endless cycle that ground through millions of individual lives without pause or reflection. The workhouses persisted in their mission, the morgues filled and emptied according to the rhythms of institutional mortality, and gradually the memory of the violations faded from immediate consciousness, becoming history rather than current concern, relegated to the past where uncomfortable truths often went to avoid disturbing the present. In the police archives at Scotland Yard, the case file grew thick with reports and statements and theories, all carefully documented and preserved, but rarely consulted once the investigation had been concluded without resolution. Ashford's successor as lead detective added a final summary in 1890, noting that no violations had been reported in more than a year, that Edward Thorne had not been located or identified with certainty, and that absent new evidence the case should be considered effectively closed, though technically unsolved. The file was placed in storage where it joined thousands of other cases representing crimes that had defeated investigation, mysteries that would remain mysteries regardless of police effort or public interest. And there it rested through the decades that followed, through the end of Victoria's reign and into the 20th century, through 2 world wars and the eventual demolition of the workhouses and the transformation of London from Victorian metropolis into modern city. The file survived in the archives because bureaucracies rarely discarded records, even of failures, preserving everything in the belief that information once created should be maintained indefinitely regardless of its utility. Researchers occasionally discovered the case, historians writing about Victorian crime or workhouse conditions or the medical profession's darker aspects, and there they would read through Ashford's careful reports and wonder about the same questions that had haunted him. Who was Edward Thorne really? Where did he go? What became of him in the end? But the archives provided no answers, only evidence of questions asked and not answered, of investigations pursued and not concluded, of crimes committed and not punished. The silence that had settled over the case in 1888 remained unbroken, as permanent as the silence of the grave itself, as complete as the darkness that had covered Thorne's work in the morgues where he had conducted his violations. History preserved the outline of events but not their resolution, documented the horror but not its ending, recorded the fear but not its relief. The workhouse morgues that had been violated were eventually demolished, replaced by other structures or simply cleared to create space for development as London expanded and rebuilt itself through the 20th century. The buildings that had housed Thorne's laboratories were torn down, their basements filled, their histories erased by progress and time. The paupers' fields were built over in many cases, the dead disturbed again not by criminals but by construction crews who occasionally unearthed remains and then reinterred them elsewhere or simply paved over them as if they had never existed. All that remained were memories held by those who had lived through the violations, and those memories faded as the individuals who carried them aged and died themselves, joining the ranks of the dead they had once tended or investigated or protected. Thomas Wickham died in 1902, taking with him the memory of that first morning when he had discovered Margaret Hollis missing. Sarah Collins died in 1915, her knowledge of the intruder she had confronted passing with her into silence. Detective Inspector Ashford died in 1920, having never learned what became of Edward Thorne, having carried the weight of the unsolved case through his final years. And with their deaths, the living connection to the violations ended, the case becoming purely historical, preserved in documents but no longer in human memory, known only to those who sought it out in archives rather than carried forward through the testimony of witnesses and investigators who had experienced the events directly. The transition from lived experience to historical record was complete, the case joining the vast catalogue of Victorian mysteries that had shaped London's past but no longer touched its present. The city moved forward, forgetting as cities do, paving over its darker histories, replacing its troubled institutions with new structures and new approaches to poverty and death and the disposal of bodies. The poor law system was reformed and eventually abolished, the workhouses closed or converted to other uses, the harsh philosophy that had justified separating families and imposing labour finally rejected as inhumane. The dead were treated with more dignity, the morgues were better secured, and the idea that someone might systematically violate bodies for anatomical collection seemed increasingly distant from modern sensibilities. Yet the case remained in the archives, waiting for anyone curious enough to seek it out, a reminder that darkness persisted even in civilized societies, that knowledge could be pursued through terrible means, that the boundary between legitimate science and criminal violation was sometimes crossed by those who convinced themselves their purposes justified their methods. The story of Edward Thorne and the workhouse morgues offered no comfortable lessons, no reassuring conclusions about justice prevailing or evil being punished. It simply existed as historical fact, documented and preserved and ultimately unresolved, a fragment of Victorian London's shadow life that had surfaced briefly before sinking back into obscurity. The final notation in the case file was made in 1955, when the Metropolitan Police conducted a review of unsolved historical cases and concluded that Edward Thorne, if still alive, would be more than 90 years old and almost certainly dead by natural causes. The case was formally closed, not because it had been solved, but because the passage of time had rendered justice impossible, even if Thorne was somehow located and identified. The file was marked closed, placed in deep storage, and gradually forgotten by everyone except the occasional researcher who stumbled across it while investigating other aspects of Victorian crime or medical history. And there, in the deep silence of institutional memory, the case of the workhouse violations finally came to rest, joining the thousands of other mysteries that had shaped London's past without ever being fully understood or resolved, preserved in documents but lost to living memory, known but not known, documented but not explained, a whisper from the past that could still be heard by those who listened carefully, but that offered no answers to the questions it raised, no resolution to the horror it described, no comfort to those who wondered what had become of the man who had violated the dead in pursuit of anatomical knowledge, and whether the darkness he represented had truly departed from the world or simply retreated into shadows where it waited, patient and eternal, for opportunities that might come again.